Welcome, wherever you are tonight. Find a comfortable place, let your body settle, and allow your eyes to grow heavy. Tonight we are going to drift together through one of the oldest stories ever told, the book of Genesis. We will wander through a garden at the very beginning of the world, when everything was quiet and new and breathing softly in the light. We will rest beside ancient rivers with names like Tigris and Euphrates, and we will follow a silver-haired man named Abraham as he walks beneath a sky so full of stars that counting them would take a lifetime. There is no hurry. We have all the time in the night. If you would like to find your way back to stories like this one, a quiet subscription will always lead you home. And before you drift away, we would love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? You are never quite as alone in the dark as it seems. The land was old before the story began. Long before any words were written, long before any hand pressed the first wedge-shaped marks into a tablet of soft clay, the land that would eventually give rise to these stories already lay beneath the same stars, breathing the same dry heat, listening to the same rivers move in the dark. It is worth resting with that for a moment. The thought that the world the Genesis narratives emerged from was already ancient when those narratives were first being shaped. That the soil of Mesopotamia and the Levant had already been farmed and flooded and walked by human feet for thousands of years before anyone sat down to give the whole of creation a beginning, a shape, a meaning. Imagine the landscape if you can without hurrying through it. The great river valley of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, lying flat and extraordinarily fertile in the places where the rivers had deposited their black silt, and dry and wind-scoured in the places where they had not. The two rivers moved slowly in summer, wide and brown and luminous in the low evening light, carrying pieces of reed and dark soil down from the northern highlands toward the southern marshes, where the water eventually lost itself in a tangle of green and the distant shimmer of the sea. In winter the rivers ran faster and colder, and in the flood seasons they could spread for miles across the plain, turning the flatlands into a shallow inland sea that reflected the clouds and confused the horizon. People had always lived beside these rivers, and they had always known that the rivers gave life and took it back, and that the boundary between water and land was not always a firm or reliable thing. Further west, the landscape changed. The river valleys gave way to the Syrian steppe, a rolling, semi-arid expanse of pale grass and limestone and dust, where the wind moved without much to stop it, and the light in the long afternoons had a quality of almost absolute clarity. Caravans crossed this country following routes that had been established for so long that they had become grooves in the collective memory of the people who used them, paths between water sources, between grazing grounds, between the cities of the river valleys and the cities of the Canaanite coast. The people who moved along these routes knew the sky in the way that only people who sleep under it regularly ever truly know it, not as a backdrop or a decoration, but as a document, a calendar, a map, a presence. And the sky above all this land was remarkable. Far from the cities, which even in the ancient world produced enough firelight and lamp smoke to soften the darkness a little at their centers, the sky at night was an overwhelming thing. The stars were not scattered so much as packed, layered, stretching from one horizon to the other, in a great arch of cold light that seemed to press down toward the earth with a weight that was almost tangible. People navigated by these stars, planted by them, prayed toward them, told stories about them. The great civilizations of Mesopotamia produced astronomers and astrologers who tracked the movements of the planets with extraordinary precision, who gave names to constellations and meaning to the paths of celestial bodies, who understood that the lights in the sky were not random, but ordered, cycling, reliable in a way that almost nothing else in the human world reliably was. This sense of the sky as ordered, as meaningful, as a place where pattern and intention could be read, this would find its way, in various forms, into the stories that Genesis would eventually tell. The cities of the ancient Near East were not small places, or simple ones. By the time the earliest layers of the Genesis traditions were being formed, and historians debate exactly when and over what period this happened, the process stretching across many centuries, Cities like Ur and Uruk in Mesopotamia were already places of considerable size and complexity, with temples that rose in terraced towers above the flat plain, with scribal schools where students spent years learning to write, with markets and workshops and administrative systems and royal courts. The temples were thought of as the earthly homes of the gods, and the priests who served in them managed grain stores and water rights and the calendars that governed planting and harvest. Religion and agriculture and governance were not separate things in this world. They were aspects of a single interwoven system of meaning, and the stories that circulated within that system were not merely entertainment or speculation, but were part of how the world was understood and maintained. It is worth knowing, as we begin our slow passage through Genesis, that this ancient world was full of stories about creation. The Mesopotamians had their own accounts of how the world had come to be. The Enuma Elish, which described a primordial battle among divine beings from whose defeated bodies the heavens and the earth were fashioned, and which was recited in the great temples as part of the New Year ceremonies. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contained, among its many wandering episodes, a flood story of remarkable closeness to the one we will encounter in Genesis, told by a man who had survived the deluge and been granted a strange, solitary immortality at the edge of the world. These stories were not secrets or obscurities. They moved through the ancient world along with trade goods and diplomatic correspondence, and it would have been nearly impossible for any literate person in the ancient Levant to have been entirely unaware of them. The scholars and scribes and storytellers who shaped the Genesis narratives lived in a world already saturated with stories about origins, and what they created was, among many other things, a profound and careful response to that world. The land of Canaan, where so much of the Genesis story unfolds, lay between the great civilizations of Mesopotamia to the east and Egypt to the southwest, and this position gave it a particular character, a place of passage, of meeting, of influence from multiple directions. The landscape itself was varied in a way that Mesopotamia's flat plains were not. There were hill country and coastal plain, deep valleys and high ridges, patches of forest and stretches of dry pasture, springs and seasonal streams that ran freely in winter and disappeared entirely in the summer heat. The people who moved through this landscape were herders and farmers and traders and craftspeople, living in small towns and villages and seasonal encampments, in a world that was intimate with the soil and the weather and the particular personalities of local water sources. The spring that was reliable, the well that could run dry, the valley that held its moisture longer than the hills above it. Lamplight was the light people lived by in this world, once the sun had gone. The small clay lamps that archaeologists find by the hundreds in the remains of ancient Near Eastern homes. Shallow, thumb-pinched dishes of fired clay, filled with olive oil, with a wick of twisted flax resting in the pinched spout, produced a warm, unsteady glow that was enough to see by and to work by, but that left the corners of rooms in deep shadow and made the darkness outside the doorway feel very close. Families gathered near the light in the evenings. Elders spoke, and children listened. Stories moved from one generation to the next in this firelit, lamp-warmed intimacy, shaped and reshaped by each telling, gathering meaning over time the way rivers gather silt. It is in this world, this ancient, story-saturated, star-canopied, river-bordered world, that the book of Genesis has its roots. Not in a vacuum, not in isolation, but in the full richness of a particular human culture at a particular moment in history, a culture that looked at the sky and the rivers and the dry hills and the lamp burning in the corner of the room, and asked the oldest questions human beings have ever asked. Where did all of this come from, and what does it mean, and who are we within it? We will not hurry through the answers that Genesis offers. We will let them come slowly, the way the ancient storytellers let them come, pausing in the places where the language pauses, resting in the images before moving through them. There is time for all of it. The night is long and quiet, and the story that has come down to us across 3,000 years or more is patient and deep and full of a strange, still beauty. For now, simply let yourself feel the weight of that old sky above the ancient land, the stars in their ordered multitudes, the rivers moving in the dark, the small lamp burning steadily in the corner of the room. All the words are still to come. The silence before the story is its own kind of gift. and it is worth receiving gently, without hurry. The first words of Genesis begin in darkness, and so it is right to let the darkness be comfortable for a little while. The darkness was without shape, and the waters were without shore, and there was, according to the most ancient telling, nothing yet that could be called a place. This is where the story begins, not with a sound, not with a movement, but with a kind of waiting that the text itself seems to hold in its breath. The opening words of the first book, words that were carried in memory long before they were ever pressed into clay or inked onto reed-smooth papyrus, describe a state so primordial that even the word beginning feels almost too solid, too architectural, for what it is trying to name. The ancient Hebrew phrase that scholars have turned over for millennia, tohu wabohu, gestures at something like formlessness, like waste, like a vast and windswept emptiness that has not yet been asked to be anything at all. And over this unformed deep, the account tells us something moved. The tradition has named it the spirit, or the breath, or the wind of the divine, and even that ambiguity is part of the texture of the telling, as if the very language wanted to remain as open and as unresolved as the darkness it was describing. It is worth resting here for a moment, in that pre-dawn of all things, before anything is separated from anything else, because the ancient world that shaped this telling understood darkness not as an enemy, but as a fabric, the same fabric from which light would be drawn like a thread. The peoples of the ancient Near East, the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Egyptians, who were neighbors and conquerors and trading partners to the communities that eventually wrote and gathered these words, all had their own accounts of how the world had come to be ordered. Many of those accounts also began in water, in chaos, in a darkness that needed to be shaped. The Genesis telling shares that deep imaginative geography, even as it moves along its own unhurried path. And then the tradition says there was light, not the light of the sun. That comes later on the fourth telling of morning and evening. This is something prior to that, something the story does not entirely explain, and perhaps does not need to. It is simply light called into being by a word and separated from the darkness, and the darkness is given its name, night, and the light is given its name, day, and the account notes with a quiet simplicity that has moved readers across thousands of years that it was good. That phrase, "it was good," will return again and again across the days that follow, like a soft chord resolving, like a breath released. The first evening comes, and the first morning follows it, and something that can now be called the first day has passed, though there was not yet a sun to mark it. And perhaps that mystery is its own kind of invitation to wonder, rather than to puzzle. The second movement of the account turns to the sky. A great expanse is drawn across the middle of the waters, holding apart the waters above from the waters below. In this vault of sky, the firmament, some translations have called it, imagining it as something solid and domed and blue, gives the world its vertical dimension, its sense of height. The peoples who first heard this account lived under very real skies, the wide, unpolluted skies of the ancient Levant, where the stars on a clear night are so numerous and so close that they seem to press down toward the hills. To look up was to see the underside of something vast, and the account gives that vastness a name and a purpose, to hold things in their places, to give the world its above and its below. Evening comes, and morning follows, and a second day has turned. On the third day, the account gathers something that feels like increasing energy, as if the story itself is beginning to enjoy the act of making. The waters below the sky are gathered together into a single place, and the dry land appears. Eretz, the Hebrew word which means simply earth, ground, the thing you stand on. And then, almost immediately, the earth is asked to bring forth something of itself, grasses and plants that seed themselves, and trees that fruit. The telling lingers on the detail of seeds, each plant producing seed after its own kind, a cycle built into the fabric of what is made, a kind of perpetual motion of growth and return. This is the world as a gardener might dream it, orderly, generous, self-renewing. The phrase comes again twice on this day, "It was good," and evening came, and morning followed, and the third day settled into its rest. The fourth day brings the sun and the moon and the stars, set into the firmament like lamps hung at different heights, and the account is careful about how it names them. The greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. Scholars have noted across many centuries that the text pointedly does not use the words sun and moon here, and some have suggested, gently, that this may be because those words in the surrounding cultures were also the names of gods, Shamash, the sun god of Babylon, and Sin, the moon, and the account is quietly insisting that these are not gods but lights, not rulers of fate but markers of seasons and days and years. They are tools of the calendar, beautiful and immense and useful, and the stars are added almost as an afterthought, in a phrase so brief it has made readers smile across the ages. And the stars also, as if the stars, all their vast and countless fire, were simply included, the way you might mention that a room also had windows. Evening came and morning, and the fourth day was done. On the fifth day the waters in the sky are populated, and here the account shifts into something that feels almost exuberant. Great sea creatures, the ancient word is Tananim, the great serpents or dragons of the deep, creatures that in other Near Eastern traditions were fearsome and chaotic, are here simply made and blessed and told to be fruitful and to fill the waters. Birds are given the open sky. The blessing that falls on them is the same blessing that will later fall on the human creatures. Be fruitful, multiply, fill your world. Life is imagined here not as a fragile and improbable thing, but as something exuberantly self-propagating, something the world was designed to hold in abundance. Evening fell softly over the waters, where the great creatures moved in the dark, and morning came again. The sixth day is the longest in the telling, as if the account knows it is building towards something and wants to give the approach its proper weight. Animals come first, creatures of the ground, livestock, things that creep and crawl, and then at last, in language that shifts almost imperceptibly into something more intimate, the account describes the making of the human creature. The tradition has been turned over and examined in this passage for longer than most of us can properly imagine. The human is made in the image, the tselem, a word that elsewhere means a statue, a representation, a likeness, of the divine, male and female together, the account says in this first telling, though a different and older feeling story will come later that tells it another way entirely. They are given dominion, a word that has been debated with great feeling in every generation since people began to read carefully. And once again, after all of it, the phrase comes, it was good. Not merely good this time, very good. And the sixth long evening came, and the sixth morning followed, and then the seventh day. And here the account does something extraordinary. It rests. The divine rests, the account says, and in resting hallows the day, blesses it, sets it apart from all the other days. This is the first thing in the Genesis narrative that is called holy. Not a place, not a creature, not a human being, but a day, a unit of time, the rest itself. And in that resting, the six-day work is sealed and completed, and the world that has been ordered out of the dark and formless waters is given its shape, its fullness, its purpose. There is a quality to the telling of that seventh day that differs from all the days before it. It has no evening. Every previous day was closed with that quiet refrain, and there was evening and there was morning, but the seventh day simply is, open-ended, without a close. The ancient interpreters noticed this, and many found in it something like an invitation, that the rest of the seventh day has in some sense never ended, that it stretches forward into time and gathers everything that comes after it into its stillness. And here, in that stillness, with the world made and the waters gathered, and the stars hanging in the great expanse, the imagination can rest too, and let the breath slow, and feel the weight of the night as something not formless at all, but full and ordered, and quietly, gently good. The next telling will take us back, as the old texts so often do, to revisit the beginning from a different angle, to a garden this time, where the ground is soft, and the rivers run clear, and two figures stand at the edge of everything that memory has yet to name. Somewhere east of everything we know, or so the ancient account would have it, there was a garden. Not a garden in the way we might picture one now, tidy rows and low stone walls, and the smell of turned earth after rain. but something wilder and more generous than that. A place where the land itself seemed to lean toward abundance, where growing things did not need to be coaxed or persuaded, but simply were, in the fullest and most unhurried sense of that word. The text of Genesis calls it Eden, and scholars have long turned that name over in careful hands, finding in its oldest roots something that breathes of lushness, of well-watered richness, of a place where the ground gives without being asked. It is a word that carries moisture in it, and shade, and the particular quality of silence that lives inside a forest when the wind has gone still. The ancient authors who shaped these words were writing, as best we can tell, sometime in the first millennium before the Common Era, though the traditions they gathered were far older than any single hand that set them down. They lived in a world of rivers and dry places, of desert margins and fertile valleys, and they knew, in the way that people who work close to the land always know, how much depends upon water. A garden needs water above all things, and so the account takes care, even in its earliest lines, to tell us that a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and that from there it parted and became 4 rivers, the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. 2 of those names the ancient listener would have recognized immediately. The Tigris and the Euphrates were the great rivers of Mesopotamia, the twin arteries of the known civilized world, the waters that fed Sumer and Akkad and Babylon and all the long succession of cities that rose and fell between them across millennia. To place the garden at the source of these rivers was to place it at the very beginning of the world that mattered, at the headwaters of history itself. The other 2 rivers, the Pishon and the Gihon, are less certain, and scholars have mapped and remapped them across centuries without final agreement, some suggesting tributaries in the Arabian Peninsula, others tracing them to rivers in Ethiopia or the Caucasus. What matters more than geography, perhaps, is the gesture. 4 rivers, flowing outward in 4 directions, the garden is the still center from which the whole known world is watered and sustained. Within this place, the account tells us, trees grew in abundance. Every tree that was pleasant to the sight and good for food. The language lingers on this, repeating it as if the abundance itself needs to be spoken slowly to be believed. And at the center of the garden stood 2 trees given particular names, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. These 2 trees have drawn the attention of readers and scholars and dreamers for thousands of years, and the traditions surrounding them stretch far beyond the pages of Genesis alone. Across the ancient Near East, the motif of a sacred tree at the center of the world appears again and again, in Sumerian poetry, in Babylonian imagery, carved into palace walls and painted onto cylinder seals. The tree at the center was a symbol of the axis of existence, the place where heaven and earth met and communed. That Genesis places not 1 such tree but 2 at the heart of Eden, one offering life, one offering knowledge, is something that interpreters have never quite finished contemplating. Into this garden, according to the tradition, came the first human figure, shaped from the dust of the ground, given breath and set to tend and keep the place. The Hebrew word used here for the human being, Adam, carries within it an echo of Adamah, the word for birth or ground, and this connection has always been understood as meaningful. The creature made from the soil, returning to care for the soil, a creature whose very name remembers where it came from. This is not the lordly dominion of a ruler over conquered land, but something closer to the role of a gardener, someone who is intimate with the place, responsible to it, shaped by it. The work given in the garden is light and unhurried. The account says nothing of sweat or exhaustion, nothing of seasons turning harsh, nothing of weeds that strangle or drought that withers. These things come later in a different world, after a different moment. Before that moment there is companionship. The account tells us that it was not good for the human to be alone, and so the animals were brought before Adam, cattle and birds and every creature of the field, and given names, one by one, in a scene that has the quality of a long, slow morning with no particular end in sight. The naming of things is not a small act in the ancient world. To name something was to know it, to stand in right relationship to it, to acknowledge its place in the order of being. And so the first humans spent time in this garden learning the names of things, turning each creature over in speech, finding the word that fit. Yet among all the named creatures, no companion was found who matched the human fully. And so the tradition tells of a sleep and a rib and a second figure waking into the same garden air. The second figure is not introduced with a name at first, but with recognition. Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, says the account, and the words carry that particular warmth of someone who has found what they did not know they were looking for. She will later be called Eve, a name the tradition links to the word for living, for the mother of all living things. But in the garden she is simply present, a companion in the shade of those generous trees, in that unhurried world where nothing is yet required to be anything other than what it is. It is worth pausing here to feel the texture of this moment, as the ancient tellers must have felt it. They lived in a world of labor, of plowing and threshing, of drawing water and grinding grain, of the seasons turning with their demands and their occasional cruelties. They knew the way the ground resists, the way a body grows tired, the way children come into the world with difficulty and leave it with grief. And so the garden in the account is not just a memory, it is a kind of ache, the imagined shape of a world before all of that became necessary. Scholars who study the Eden narrative in its ancient context often note that it reads less like a description of a literal place and more like a meditation on origins, on the gap between how things are and how something in the human heart imagines they might once have been, or might yet be, somewhere beyond the boundary of ordinary days. The account tells of a serpent, the most subtle of the creatures, and of a conversation beside the tree of knowledge, and of a fruit taken and given and tasted, and of eyes opened to a new kind of knowing that brought with it a new kind of unease. The tradition has carried this story across cultures and centuries with extraordinary persistence, and historians have noted its deep roots in the ancient Near Eastern literary soil. The Babylonian story of Adapa, who lost the chance at immortality through a misunderstanding about food. The Sumerian paradise of Dilmun, where sickness and death were unknown, and a goddess of the rib was made to heal a wounded god. These older stories do not explain Genesis away, but they remind us that the Eden narrative was composed by people who were part of a vast web of shared human wondering about the same deep questions. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why does the ground resist us? Why do we know so much and yet feel so lost? After the tasting, after the moment of knowing, the account describes a change in the quality of the air itself. The man and woman hear the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. The cool of the day, that phrase like a particular slant of late afternoon light, familiar and golden, and almost painful in its ordinariness. They hide among the trees. A voice calls, "Where are you?" And the world that had been so still and sufficient begins quietly and without drama to become the world we recognize. What follows the words spoken, the changed conditions of existence, the departure from the garden to the east, is the hinge between one kind of story and another. Labor and seasons and the long work of being human begin here. The account places a cherubim and a turning flaming sword at the garden's gate, which the tradition has always understood as a closing, a passage that cannot be reopened by simply walking back the way one came. And yet the garden does not disappear from the human story entirely. It lingers at the edge of things in the way that certain rivers still carry the names the ancient world gave them, flowing through a landscape that has changed beyond recognition, while the water itself moves on, unhurried, exactly as it always has. Let that image rest with you now. Water moving through the dark, the sound of a river you cannot quite see, the trees of a garden somewhere quiet and full of green shade. The next part of the story will carry us forward into the wide world beyond the gate, into the lives of those who were born into the changed and laboring earth. But that world can wait until morning, or until another soft and unhurried hour. For now, let the rivers run gently through whatever rest is waiting for you, and allow the weight of the day to settle, slowly, into the dark. The gate of the garden, according to the tradition, was guarded by a turning sword of flame. And so the world east of that threshold became the world of ordinary human time, of soil that pushed back against the hand, of seasons that did not ask permission before turning cold, of children born into a life that was already older and heavier than the life their parents had first known. It is worth pausing here, before following the story further east, to feel the texture of that world as the ancient account imagines it. The land beyond Eden in the Genesis narrative is not a wasteland. It is simply the world. The dry hills and the river valleys, the smell of turned earth in the morning, the sound of animals moving through scrub and grass as the light comes up slow and amber over the horizon. The fire that lit the turning sword at the garden's edge was distant now, a memory behind them, and ahead lay everything that human beings would learn to call home. The account tells of two sons born to the first man and the first woman after their departure from the garden, and the names the tradition has given them carry their own quiet meaning. Cain, whose name in the Hebrew sounds something like a word for acquiring or possessing, was a tiller of the ground, a man of the soil, someone who learned to read the seasons and coax life from the earth with his hands. Abel, whose name the tradition has sometimes linked to a word for breath or vapor, something light, something that passes, was a keeper of flocks, a herder moving with animals across open land. The story that has come down to us is one of offering and its reception. Both brothers brought something of what they had made and tended to lay before the divine. Cain brought the fruit of the ground, the produce of his labor. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock. The account says that the offering of Abel was looked upon with favor, and the offering of Cain was not, and it leaves this quietly, without a full explanation, the way ancient stories often do, presenting a fact and letting the weight of it rest in the air, without rushing to resolve the discomfort it creates. Historians and interpreters have spent long centuries turning this moment over gently, looking at it from many angles. Some have read in it a reflection of the ancient world's shifting relationships between pastoral peoples and agricultural ones, the herder and the farmer, whose ways of life sometimes moved alongside each other and sometimes pressed against one another across the same dry hills. The Iron Age Levant, the world in which much of this text took its shape, knew both kinds of life in close proximity, and the tension between them was real and ordinary and not always easy to resolve. Whether or not this was the account's original intent, what the story carries forward is not the cause of Cain's anger, but the weight of it. The account describes his face falling, his countenance dropping, and the voice in the narrative asks him, gently it seems, or at least that is how the words have often been read, whether he is not able to master what lies crouching at the door of him. And then the brothers go out into the field together, and something passes between them that the text does not describe in detail, and Abel is gone. The tradition records this as the first death in the human story, and the earth itself, according to the account, bears witness. The voice that comes to Cain asks where his brother is, and Cain gives the answer that has echoed across thousands of years of reading, the answer of someone who has decided, however briefly, that he is not his brother's keeper. The earth, the story says, has received the blood and is crying out. The same ground that Cain had learned to tend and cultivate becomes the ground that will no longer yield to him. He is set apart to wander. And yet, in the way of these ancient narratives, wandering is not the end of anything. It is, in a strange way, a beginning. The account tells that Cain went east of Eden into a land called Nod, a name that carries in it the sound of wandering itself, of rootlessness, of moving without arriving, and that he built a city there, or at least the beginning of one, and that he named it for his son Enoch. There is something quietly remarkable about this detail. The man marked for wandering is also the man who builds. The one set apart from the ground becomes, in the story's logic, a founder of settlement. The tradition hands this to us without resolving the contradiction, and perhaps the contradiction is not meant to be resolved, but simply held. From Enoch, the genealogy of Cain moves outward across several generations, through names that the account preserves without ceremony: Irad, Mehujael, Methushael, Lamech, and it is in the generation of Lamech that the narrative pauses again to listen. Lamech, the account says, took 2 wives, and the names of those wives are given, Ada and Zillah, and their children carry with them the seeds of what will become human culture as the ancient world knew it. Jabal is said to be the ancestor of those who dwell in tents and keep livestock. Jubal is called the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe, the first musician in the tradition's memory, the one from whom all music descends. And Tubal-Cain, the name preserving something of both father and grandfather, is linked in the account to those who work with bronze and iron, the shapers of metal, the makers of tools and weapons. There is a strange beauty in the way the narrative places these origins here, in the lineage of Cain, the wanderer, the marked man, music and metalwork and herding and tent-dwelling, the things that make human life recognizable, the things that archaeologists find traces of in the deep layers of Near Eastern sites. All of this flows, in the story's genealogical logic, from a man set outside the garden, carrying a mark, going east. It is as if the tradition is saying, quietly, that civilization grows precisely from dislocation, from loss, from the long walk away from something that cannot be returned to. After the Cain lineage, the account turns back to the first parents and follows a different line, the line through Seth, a third son given, the tradition says, in place of Abel. And here the genealogies begin in earnest, those long lists of names and years that can seem, at first, like passages meant only to be moved through quickly. But there is a texture to them, a slow music of accumulation that rewards a patient and unhurried attention. The genealogy that runs through Seth, Adam to Noah in the 5th chapter of Genesis, is one of the most famous of these lists, partly because of the extraordinary lifespans it records. Adam 930 years, Seth 912, Enosh 905, and so on through Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, until the account reaches Methuselah, whose 969 years made his name a byword in every language that inherited this text. Historians have long discussed what to make of these numbers, and the explanations are many and varied. Some point to similar lists from ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list, which names rulers before a great flood who reigned for tens of thousands of years each, and suggest that the Genesis genealogies are working in a tradition of deep time, a way of marking the distance between now and then as something more than merely long. Whether the numbers were meant literally or symbolically or as part of a larger literary structure remains something scholars continue to turn over carefully. Within the genealogy, however, one figure is named differently from all the others. Enoch, the son of Jared, is given only 365 years, the number that matches the days of the solar year, and the account does not say he died. It says in a phrase that has generated more meditation and interpretation than almost any other in the genealogies, that he walked with God, and then he was not. The story goes that he was taken, without death, without an ending that the narrative pauses to describe. He simply moves out of the list, into a silence that the text does not try to fill. It is a detail that the account lets breathe, and perhaps that is the right way to meet it here as well. Not to press too hard against it, not to demand from it more certainty than it offers, but simply to notice that in a genealogy full of dying, the text pauses over one name and says, not this one, not in the ordinary way. And then the list continues. The names flow on, one generation giving way to the next, each begetting and living and dying in turn, the slow rhythm of the genealogy carrying the story forward from the gate of the garden toward a horizon that is still far off and unnamed. The world is filling up with people in the logic of the account. The camps and settlements are multiplying. The smoke of fires rises in the evening over many valleys. And somewhere in all of that growing world, the account is quietly gathering itself toward rain. The air smells of wood smoke and river mud, and somewhere not far away, a dog is barking at something it cannot name in the dark. It is night in the ancient world, in the time before the flood that the story remembers, and the villages along the great rivers are settling into their familiar quietness. The fires inside the low houses have burned down to their orange cores, and the people who tended them have drawn their woven covers close and let their breathing slow to match the breathing of the animals tethered just outside. The goats and the donkeys and the heavy-shouldered cattle whose warmth rises in slow columns of pale steam into the cool air. The stars above the plain are extraordinary in their number, unhidden by any other light, hanging so thickly over the flat and open land that they seem less like individual points and more like the texture of the sky itself, as if the darkness were merely the space between bright things rather than the other way around. This is the world that Genesis inherited, not an invented world, but a real one, with weight and smell and the ordinary difficulty of daily life pressing against it from every direction. Archaeologists have drawn it up from the soil over many patient decades, reading the burnt layers in the broken pottery and the carbonized grain as carefully as any scholar reads a manuscript. The settlements that dotted the Mesopotamian plain in those deep centuries were built of mud brick, shaped by hand and dried under a sun that in summer was relentless, and the houses they formed were clustered close together along narrow lanes where the dust rose with every footstep and settled again slowly, coating everything in the same pale beige that the land itself wore. These were not primitive places, though they were old. They had granaries and workshops, weavers and potters and metal workers, people who understood the annual behavior of the rivers and had built their entire way of life around the rhythms of flood and planting and harvest. The great rivers were everything. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not merely border this world, they made it, depositing the black alluvial soil that was among the most fertile on the earth, and carrying with them the memory of mountains far to the north, mountains that most people on the plain would never see, whose snow they would never touch, but whose seasonal melting would arrive in their fields weeks later as rising water, brown and heavy with the silt that became their bread. The people of these river valleys understood water with an intimacy that is difficult to imagine now, when water comes reliably through pipes and its absence is an inconvenience rather than a death. For them, water was the first fact of existence, the precondition for everything. The substance whose surplus could drown a village and whose absence could erase it just as completely. It is said that the memories of great floods were very old in these lands, older than any written record, carried in story long before anyone thought to press a reed into wet clay and make the sound of a word into a permanent thing. The soil itself confirms that floods of extraordinary size had moved through the Tigris and Euphrates valleys in deep antiquity, leaving thick, pale bands of water-deposited sediment between the darker layers of human habitation, visible evidence of inundations that must have seemed, to anyone who experienced them, like the end of everything familiar. The story that Genesis tells about the flood arrived into the world already surrounded by other stories, told among the peoples of the same plain, and the resemblances between them suggest that all these accounts were drawing from the same deep well of memory, the same ancestral experience of water rising beyond all expectation, beyond all boundary, covering the land until the land was not there anymore. But that is the story that comes next. For now, in the time before, the villages sleep. A woman wakes briefly to tend an infant, and then sleeps again, her hand resting on the child's chest to feel its breathing. Outside, the donkey shifts its weight, and the rope tethering it moves against the post with a small wooden sound. On the flat roof of the house next to hers, a man is sleeping in the open air because the nights are warm, his arm thrown across his eyes to block the starlight, and his slow and even breath is indistinguishable from the breeze moving across the rooftop. Somewhere down the lane, the smell of bread baking drifts from a house where someone has woken before the others and begun the morning's work while it is still dark, because the morning comes early in these latitudes and the bread needs time. This texture of life, the bread and the rope and the sleeping child, is not invented entirely from imagination. The archaeology of the ancient Near East has recovered fragments of the everyday with extraordinary tenderness, clay sickles and stone grinding tools worn smooth by thousands of repetitions of the same circular motion, small clay figures that may have stood in household shrines, carbonized lentils and emmer wheat preserved in sealed vessels through millennia of darkness, leather sandals, bone needles, the tiny imprints of reed mats in the floors of houses whose walls dissolved long ago, but whose floors remained. These objects do not tell stories in words, but they describe a life with their shapes and their wear, a life of repetitive labor and small comfort, of keeping things and losing things, and making do with what could be made or grown or traded. Trade moved along the rivers and along the desert roads between the rivers and the sea, and the merchants who walked or sailed those routes carried more than goods. They carried names and stories and the habits of distant places, and a traveler arriving in a riverside settlement from upstream would bring news of the water levels, of the behavior of the current, of anything unusual seen along the way. The interconnectedness of these ancient communities along the waterways was real and active, and the stories that traveled with the merchants would have mingled and merged as naturally as tributaries merge with the rivers that received them. The children of these villages would have grown up hearing the old stories in the evenings. In the cooling air, after the work was finished, when the fire was built up again and its light fell warmly across the faces of the elders, the telling of stories in the ancient world was not entertainment in the way the word suggests to us now, something optional, something set apart from the serious business of living. It was itself a form of knowledge transmission, a way of carrying understanding from one generation to the next, of answering the questions that the world posed without ceasing. Why are things the way they are? Why does the river rise and fall? Why do people suffer? Where did we come from, and where do the dead go? The stories in Genesis, in the understanding of scholars who have studied them, were doing this kind of work. They were not written down at first. They were spoken and remembered and spoken again, shaped by the telling and by the silence that surrounded the telling, by the firelight and the nighttime and the particular faces of the people listening. And so the world that the flood remembered was not a world of villains or of heroes, but of ordinary people doing ordinary things in the way that had always been done, tending their animals and grinding their grain and watching their children grow and watching the river for signs of what the coming season would bring. They built their houses of mud brick, knowing that the mud brick would dissolve in heavy rain and need to be repaired, and they repaired it season after season, because that was what you did. They stored their grain against the dry months, and they hoped, and they told their stories, and the stars turned above them with their ancient patience, indifferent and beautiful. The fire in the low house burns a little lower. The dog that was barking has settled into silence. The child has found the rhythm of sleep again, and the woman beside it has drawn her hand back under the cover, and the warmth of the small enclosed room is its own kind of safety, impermanent and ordinary, and very dear. Outside, above the rooftops and the dozing animals and the quiet lanes, the sky is beginning, only just beginning, to lighten at its far eastern edge, where the river bends away into the darkness and the stars nearest the horizon are growing faint, absorbed into the first pale suggestion of another day arriving. The world holds its breath for a moment in that passage between night and the not yet morning, the way it always has, the way it always will. And somewhere, a long way upriver, the water is already beginning to rise. The rain, when it comes in the ancient Near East, comes slowly at first, a distant darkening at the edge of the sky, a stillness in the air that makes the birds go quiet, a smell like wet stone rising from the earth before a single drop has fallen. And it is into just such a gathering stillness that the story carries us now, deeper into the world the Genesis account has been building, layer by careful layer, since those first words moved across the formless deep. We have already spent time in that world before the flood, its villages and cooking fires, its children and its evening sounds. Now the account turns, and the sky begins to change. The narrative of Noah and the Great Flood is one of the oldest and most widely told stories in human literary memory. The Genesis account, as scholars understand it, is woven together from at least two distinct ancient source traditions, each with its own texture and emphasis, braided so closely over centuries of transmission that they have become, for most readers, a single flowing story. Historians and textual scholars have traced the seams, different names for the divine, different numbers of animals, slightly different timelines, and they note these details with quiet interest, the way a careful reader notices that a beloved old garment has been mended more than once and is all the richer for it. According to the tradition, Noah is a man of 600 years when the rains begin. He has spent what the account describes as a long and remarkable stretch of time preparing, building a vessel of great cedar wood, sealed with pitch inside and out, a vessel of 3 stories, with rooms and a single door set in its side. The story goes that the dimensions given, 300 cubits in length, 50 in width, 30 in height, made for an enormous stable hull, more barge than ship, designed not to sail anywhere in particular, but simply to float, to endure, to wait. Archaeologists and engineers have occasionally marveled at these proportions, noting that the ratio of length to width describes a vessel of considerable stability in open water, though the tradition is not a technical document and was never meant to be read as one. Into this vessel, the account tells us, Noah gathered living creatures, pairs of animals, of birds, of everything that moved upon the earth. In some passages of the text, the number is 2 of each kind, in others 7 pairs of the clean animals and 2 of the unclean, a distinction that later in the tradition carries great significance. Both counts sit side by side in the Genesis text, unhurried by contradiction, as ancient storytelling so often allows. And then the door is closed, and the rain begins. The account describes a flooding not merely from above, but from below. The windows of heaven opened, yes, and the rain fell in sheets and curtains upon the world, but also the fountains of the great deep burst forth, as though the waters below the earth, those primordial waters that had been separated and ordered on the second day of creation, were reclaiming their ancient territory. It is a poetic and deliberate image, the careful ordering of the creation story beginning in some sense to loosen, the world returning briefly toward the formless and the deep. For 40 days and 40 nights, the account tells, the rain continued, a number that appears again and again in the ancient tradition as a marker of a long, complete, and transformative duration. The water rose, it covered the hills, and then the mountains, and the vessel floated upon the surface of everything the world had been. There is a particular quality of silence that the imagination reaches for here. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a world made entirely of gray water and gray sky, with no birdsong, no wind through grasses, no sound of a distant village. Only the water and the slow creaking of timber and the rain. Now, what makes the Genesis flood narrative so remarkable to historians of the ancient Near East is that it does not stand alone. It floats, if you will allow the image, in a sea of related stories from the same broad region, stories that are older in their written form and share with the Genesis account an extraordinary number of features. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian narrative preserved on clay tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, contains a flood story that scholars believe draws on even earlier Sumerian traditions. In that account, a man named Utnapishtim, or in the older Sumerian versions Usudra, is warned of a coming flood by a god, instructed to build a great vessel, fills it with animals and his family, survives the waters, and eventually releases birds to test for dry land. The parallels are close enough that historians have no doubt the traditions are connected in some way across the deep channels of ancient Near Eastern cultural exchange. Though the exact nature of that connection, whether one borrowed from another or both drew from a common older source, remains a question scholars continue to discuss with great interest. The Babylonian flood hero sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven. The Genesis account sends out a raven and then a dove twice. In both traditions, the bird's return or non-return signals the retreat of the waters. These are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of a shared ancient world, a world of great river valleys where flooding was a real and remembered terror, where the sight of a bird returning with a fresh leaf in its beak would have carried the most overwhelming imaginable relief. In the Genesis account, the dove returns the first time with nothing. Noah waits. 7 days pass, that sacred recurring number of completion, and he sends the dove again, and this time toward evening, it returns with a fresh olive leaf in its beak. The account notes this with a quiet precision. It is evening, the light is low, and there in the bird's small beak is the color green, the first green thing seen since the world drowned, a leaf still living, meaning that somewhere below, the trees are emerging from the water, and the earth is still there, patient and waiting, beneath everything that has covered it. The third time the dove is sent, it does not return at all. It has found the world again. Noah removes the covering of the ark and looks out. The ground is dry. The account tells us this happens in the 601st year of Noah's life, on the first day of the first month. A detail so precise, it feels almost like a birthday, as though the world itself is being born again into clean morning air. They emerge, Noah and his family and all the living creatures, stepping out onto ground that is firm and solid and warm. The account describes an offering made, a fire kindled, the smell of the smoke rising in the still air. And here, the story arrives at something it has been traveling toward since the first darkening of that ancient sky. A covenant, a promise carried in something as quiet and as extraordinary as light through water. But that promise and the bow set in the clouds and all the nations that will spread from this new beginning, those belong to the chapter that waits just ahead, patient as morning. For now, let the image rest with you. The dove flying low over a world still glistening with receding water, finding a branch, turning back toward the great wooden vessel with its single door, and landing gently, gently, with a leaf still green between its wings. The long rain is over. The deep has returned to its place. The world is quiet and wet and new. Let that water settle in your mind as the night deepens around you. The sound of it receding, drawing back from hilltops and valleys, returning to its ancient boundaries, the way water always eventually finds its level and grows still. Rest now in that stillness, and let the next morning in all its gentle wonders wait for you a little while longer. The waters have gone down now, slowly, the way all great things end. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in gradual recession, day by day. The mudflats widening at the edges of the world, the peaks of distant hills appearing first as dark smudges, and then as solid, breathing earth. The ark rests. The family has come out into the light. And what remains after all of that, after the long gray weeks, the sound of rain that became the only sound there was, is something quieter than before, and somehow more fragile, and somehow more full of promise than anything that had come before it. The tradition tells us that the first thing Noah did upon solid ground was build an altar and offer thanksgiving, and it is easy, lying here in the dimming quiet of your own night, to imagine what that moment might have felt like. The strange luxury of standing still on earth that did not sway or creak, the smell of wet soil and bruised grass, the sky above emptied of cloud and beginning slowly to fill with a color that no word quite captures, that color which comes between the gray of storm and the blue of ordinary day. And then, the account tells us, there came the bow across the sky. According to the tradition, what the text describes is not merely beautiful. It is formal. It is the language of ancient treaty. In the world of the ancient Near East, covenants were sealed with signs, with words repeated and witnessed. And here the tradition reaches for the grandest possible witness. The arch of light that appears when rain and sun meet at just the right angle. That vast curved thing that spans from one edge of sight to the other, and seems almost too large to be meant for any single human eye. The account records the words plainly and without embellishment. A promise made not only to Noah and his household, but the text says carefully, to every living creature, to the birds and the cattle and the wild things that had come off the ramp and scattered back into the world. There is something enormously gentle in that detail, that the covenant is made with the animals too, that they are counted among those who receive the promise. This is the close of one great movement in the Genesis narrative, and the hinge into another. Behind lies the deep, formless world, the water, the garden, the long genealogies stretching like roots through the darkness. Ahead lies something different, a world being repopulated, diversifying, spreading outward along river valleys and coastlines and highland plains, becoming the various and particular world that the ancient authors and their listeners actually inhabited. The text moves after the covenant into what scholars often call the Table of Nations, a careful, almost cartographic list of the descendants of Noah's three sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, spreading across the known world in every direction. Historians find this passage remarkable because it reflects quite accurately in many places the ancient Near Eastern understanding of the peoples and territories surrounding the Levant. The sons of Japheth, the account tells, spread northward and westward into regions that would become known as Anatolia, the coast of the Aegean, the highlands of the Caucasus. The sons of Ham spread southward and westward into Egypt, into Canaan, into the regions beyond. And the sons of Shem, from whom the tradition traces the lineage that will eventually bring us to Abram, settled into the lands between the great rivers and along the arc of the Fertile Crescent. It is a way of saying, we are all cousins. All these peoples, however different their languages and customs and gods, share in the architecture of this ancient story a single point of origin, a single muddy mountaintop where a family stepped out into mourning. Historians debate how literally this genealogical schema was intended, whether it was understood as biological fact or as a way of mapping the world's relationships in the language available to ancient minds, the language of kinship and descent. But what is not in question is the impulse behind it, the desire to hold the whole human world within a single story, to say that the many came from the one, and the one from the water, and the water from the beginning of all things. And then the narrative pauses at a city, or the dream of a city. The story of the Tower of Babel is one of the most familiar passages in Genesis, and also, in some ways, one of the most quietly strange. The setting the text gives us is Shinar, a name that most historians associate with the region of ancient Mesopotamia, the broad, flat plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where some of the earliest cities the world has known rose from river mud and human ambition. The people, the account says, found a plain and settled there, and they spoke one language, and they began to build. The building they describe is not a vague or symbolic structure. They make bricks, the text specifies, baked bricks, and they use bitumen for mortar. And these are precisely the materials that archaeologists have found in the ruins of the great Mesopotamian cities, the ziggurats of Ur and Eridu and Babylon, those vast step towers that rose from the flat plain like artificial mountains, and whose upper temples were meant to be the dwelling places of the gods, the places where heaven and earth were understood to meet. It is said that standing at the base of such a structure and looking upward, it could seem as though the top was hidden in cloud, as though the thing reached beyond what human eyes could follow. The account tells that the tower was left unfinished, that the builders were scattered across the face of the earth, their single language dissolved into the many tongues that the author's world contained. Linguists and historians note that the text contains a gentle wordplay, a connection between the name Babel and the Hebrew word for confusion, though the great city of Babylon understood its own name quite differently, as something meaning gate of God. The tradition holds both meanings lightly, does not press the point too hard, and what remains after the story is not the tower itself, but the image of departure, people moving outward from a central place, carrying their new and separate languages with them like seeds carried by wind, settling in river valleys and on coastlines, becoming over long generations. The various peoples of the Table of Nations, each with their own names for the sky and the water and the light. There is something restful, rather than sorrowful, in the way this chapter of Genesis closes. The scattering is not presented as pure punishment in the way the tradition has sometimes read it. It can be heard just as reasonably as the completion of what was always meant to happen, the filling of the wide earth that the covenant after the flood had already promised. The peoples drift apart the way embers drift from a fire on a still night, each one carrying something of the original light, each one coming to rest in its own place, each one eventually cooling into the particular shape of a culture, a language, a way of understanding the stars overhead and the ground underfoot. And the stars are important, because it is under the stars that the next great movement of the Genesis narrative begins. From the scattered peoples from the lineage of Shem, the account will draw one thread. A single family in a city between the rivers, about to begin the longest journey in the book. The world of Mesopotamia waits in the darkness ahead. Its reed marshes and its temple towers, its merchant roads and its river crossings, its night skies full of the same stars that hang above you now in your own quiet room. But that is for another evening's wandering. For now, let the image of the bow rest in your mind, that great arc of quiet color laid across a sky that has finally stopped raining, the sign of the covenant given not in words carved on stone, but in light itself, in the ordinary and extraordinary phenomenon of water and sun finding each other at just the right angle, that gentle reminder written across the air above a world that is beginning, once again, to breathe. Let the scattered peoples settle into their valleys. Let the languages drift apart like music heard from different rooms. Let the unfinished tower stand quiet on its plain, and let the wind move through the grasses at its base, and let the light of the morning that follows every long night gather. The smell of river mud reaches you before anything else, dark and faintly sweet, the kind of smell that clings to reed matting and to the hems of linen robes, the kind that settles into the walls of mud brick houses and never quite leaves them. This is the smell of the land between the rivers, the great flat country that the ancient Greeks would one day call Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, though in the time the Genesis tradition is reaching back toward, those rivers had no Greek names at all. They were simply the waters, the twin arteries of a world so old and so layered with human settlement that even the people who lived there would have understood themselves as inhabitants of a very ancient place, heirs to cities and customs and ways of counting days, that stretched back further than their own stories could clearly see. The Euphrates runs broad and slow through that country, carrying with it the pale silt of mountains far to the north, mountains the river has long since left behind. Along its banks, in the centuries that the Genesis account appears to be gesturing toward, somewhere in the early second millennium before the Common Era, though historians continue to debate the precise placing of these traditions, there stood cities of considerable size and complexity. Ur was one of them, and it is from Ur that the account will tell us Abram's family came, though the archaeology of Ur reminds us that this was no simple village of tent dwellers. A city excavated in the early 20th century of our own era revealed streets of two-story houses, a great ziggurat of mud brick rising toward the sky like a stepped mountain made by human hands, temples to the moon god Nana, workshops where craftspeople shaped gold and lapis lazuli into objects of astonishing delicacy, cylinder seals, clay tablets covered in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform writing, receipts and hymns and lists of grain, all of it pointing to a world dense with administration and ritual and daily life. In such a city, in the broad, ordinary days of its existence, people rose before dawn to the sound of other people, water carriers moving through narrow lanes, the low of cattle in the outer districts, the rhythmic slap of bread being shaped and set beside a fire. The fire in a Mesopotamian household of this period would have burned in a small clay hearth, the light of it amber and close, throwing warm shadows across the faces of the household as they woke into the day. Oil lamps, too, small shallow dishes of fired clay filled with sesame oil or animal fat, with a wick of twisted plant fiber, drawing the fuel upward into a flame no bigger than a thumb, the lights under which accounts were tallied, and children were told stories, and the old recited the names of the gods. The gods of Mesopotamia were many, and their names were long, and their stories were elaborate, laid out in texts that scribes copied and recopied in the great temples, texts that dealt with creation and flood and the nature of human life in terms that will feel to anyone familiar with Genesis strangely and beautifully resonant. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation account, begins in a watery formlessness not entirely unlike the deep over which the Genesis account will tell us the wind of God moved. The Epic of Gilgamesh carries within it a flood story, a boat, a survivor, birds sent out to test for dry land, details so close to the Genesis flood narrative that scholars have spent generations examining the relationship between them, wondering about shared traditions and parallel streams of memory flowing down through the centuries. None of this is settled, and it is not the kind of question that resolves cleanly into a single answer, but it points to something worth holding gently in mind, that the Genesis narratives emerged from a world already saturated with ancient story, and that the people who first heard or read these accounts would have recognized the landscape of ideas, even as they heard something new being said within it. From Ur, the Genesis account tells us, Abram's father Terah gathered his household and began moving northward along the great river road. This was not an unusual thing to do. The caravan roads of the ancient Near East followed the rivers wherever possible, because water meant camping, meant fodder for animals, meant trading posts and way stations where a traveler could find shelter and exchange news and purchase supplies. The road from Ur northward along the Euphrates would have passed through many smaller settlements, through marshland where birds rose in dark clouds at dusk, through stretches of open plain where the sky seemed to press down close on either side of the river like two vast hands cupped around the water. Donkeys carried the loads, donkeys and perhaps some cattle, and the household goods that make a family recognizable to itself. The grinding stone, the tent poles and their coverings, the small clay figures that sat in household shrines, the accumulated objects of ordinary life. The city of Haran, where the account tells us Terah settled and where he died, lay in the far north of what is now southeastern Turkey, in a region that sits at the crossing point of several important routes, the road that runs east to west between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast, and the road that runs north to south between Anatolia and the Levant. It was a place that people passed through, a place where merchants stopped, and nomadic groups watered their flocks, and where news arrived from many directions. Haran was also, it is said, a center of the moon god's worship, the same lunar deity revered in Ur, and this detail, if it rests on anything historical, suggests a cultural thread connecting the two cities across the long miles of river road. But it is the night sky over all of this landscape that draws the attention most insistently when one tries to imagine the world in which the Abram tradition was first taking shape. In a world without electric light, without the soft orange haze that now blurs the edges of every modern city at night, the sky after dark was a different order of experience entirely. The stars of the ancient Near East were not background decoration. They were read and named and mapped. Babylonian astronomers, priests really, because the boundary between astronomy and religion did not exist in the way we might imagine it, kept careful records of celestial movements on clay tablets, tracking the planets, noting the risings and settings of particular stars, watching for omens and eclipses and conjunctions. To stand outside a mud-brick city on a clear night, or on a hillside in the open country of the Levant, and to look upward was to look at a sky that felt inhabited, purposeful, deeply legible to those who had been taught to read it. The Milky Way would have arched overhead in such clarity on a dark night that its structure, the suggestion of depth, of enormous distance, would have been plainly visible to the naked eye. The great stars of the summer and winter skies, Scorpius low in the south, Orion rising in the cold months with his belt of 3 aligned points of light, would have been companions as familiar as the sounds of the camp at evening. And it is under exactly this kind of sky the Genesis account will soon tell us that a covenant will be made, that a man will be asked to count the stars if he is able, and that a promise vast enough to need the whole visible night sky for its illustration will be spoken into the darkness. But that moment comes in the chapter ahead, and there is no need to hurry toward it now. Let the landscape be what it is for a little while longer. The wide plain between the rivers, the smell of the Euphrates on a warm afternoon, the sound of a city going about its ancient business, the roads leading westward and southward toward a land not yet seen by these particular eyes. Let the caravan rest in the dust of early evening, the animals settling, the cook fire being lit with steady and practiced hands, the small clay lamp placed carefully in the opening of the tent so that its flame burns without trembling in the still air. The light it throws is warm and amber and very close, falling on familiar faces, on the worn leather of a waterskin, on the hands of someone who is thinking of a journey not yet begun. Everything is quiet. The fire breathes softly. The stars are just beginning to appear. The caravan road stretched northward out of the city in the early hours before full light, when the air still carried the cool memory of night, and the stars had not yet faded entirely from the rim of the sky. It was along roads very much like this one, rutted by generations of wheels, soft with the dust of 10,000 departures, that the account places Abram at the beginning of his long journey, a man of Ur setting his face toward the unfamiliar, walking into a story that the tradition has carried forward across more than 3,000 years of telling and retelling. The account in Genesis does not give us Abram's age at this first departure, though it tells us that his father Terah was the one who gathered the household together and led them northward, away from Ur of the Chaldeans, intending, the text says, to go to the land of Canaan. We do not know precisely why Terah moved, or what combination of economic necessity, family restlessness, or perhaps some older impulse moved him to pack up so large a household and set it walking along the great river roads. Archaeologists and historians note that the early second millennium before the Common Era was a time of considerable movement across Mesopotamia and the Levant, a time when semi-nomadic and pastoralist groups drifted with their flocks between settled towns, following seasonal grazing and the slow logic of water and pasture. Abram's world, whatever its precise dating, was not unusual in its mobility. What the tradition marks as extraordinary is something else entirely, the particular quality of attention that this one journey carried, the sense of a call moving through it like a thread of starlight through dark cloth. Haran lay somewhere to the north and west, in the region that historians associate with the upper reaches of the Euphrates, a city that appears in ancient records as a real and thriving place, a node on the trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with the lands of the Levant and beyond. The name itself is related, it is thought, to a word for road or caravan, and so there is something quietly fitting in the idea of a traveling family pausing here, a crossroads city receiving a family of wanderers. The account tells us that Terah settled in Haran, and that he died there at the great age, as the genealogies give it, of 205 years. These enormous patriarchal ages are one of the places where historians note the clearest distance between the Genesis world and the world of modern biography. They seem to belong to a different kind of reckoning, a way of measuring significance and ancestral weight, rather than counting calendar years in the way we do now. We hold them gently as part of the texture of the tradition and let them rest there without pressing too hard. It is in Haran, after Terah's death, that the call comes to Abram directly in the Genesis account. The instruction to leave his country, his kindred, his father's house, and to go to a land that will be shown to him. There is a quality in the Hebrew of this passage that has moved translators and readers across many centuries, a kind of laconic economy in which enormous things are said in very few words. Go, it says essentially, leave, walk toward the place I will show you. The destination is not named at the moment of the command, and this openness, this instruction to walk toward something not yet visible, is one of the things that has made the call of Abram so resonant across so many different religious traditions and so many different kinds of human experience. The scholars and theologians have debated its layers endlessly. For our purposes tonight, we can simply rest in the image. A man in a city that is not quite home, receiving a direction without a detailed map, and beginning to move. Abram was, the account tells us, 75 years old when he departed from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had gathered, and all the persons who had joined their household. For a prosperous semi-nomadic family of this world would have included not just blood relatives, but servants, workers, and people who attached themselves to a successful household for protection and livelihood. Historians and archaeologists note that this kind of extended household group, moving with flocks of sheep and goats, donkeys for carrying loads, and tents for shelter, would have been a recognizable sight on the roads of the ancient Levant. They were not wanderers in the sense of being lost. They knew the roads, they knew where the wells were, they knew the seasonal rhythms of grazing and rain. What the Genesis account layers over this thoroughly ordinary ancient Near Eastern social reality is a sense of divine accompaniment, of a promise being carried along with the baggage and the flocks, invisible but present. They came into the land of Canaan, the account says, simply, as though the arrival itself needed no elaboration. And Abram passed through the land as far as the place called Shechem, to the oak, or the great tree, as some translations give it, of Moreh. Shechem appears in archaeological records as an ancient and significant site in the central hill country of Canaan, a place where roads met and settlements clustered, and the great trees associated with it in the Genesis narrative hint at a landscape that once held ancient groves, their shade and permanence making them natural gathering places and landmarks. At Shechem, according to the account, the promise is renewed. This is the land, Abram is told, that will be given to his descendants. He builds an altar there, a simple act of acknowledgement, and moves on. He moved on, as the text has it, toward the hill country east of Bethel, pitching his tent between Bethel and Ai, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east, a description that allows modern archaeologists to triangulate somewhat, though the precise identification of ancient Ai has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate across many decades. He built another altar there and called on the name of his God, and then, following the logic of the land and the season, and driven, the text notes, by a famine, he journeyed still further south, into Egypt, and returned again, and then moved through the Negev, the dry and stony southern country, and back northward through the central hills. This pattern of movement, northward and southward, between the hill country and the more fertile coastal zones, down into Egypt in times of hardship and back again, is precisely the kind of seasonal and famine-driven migration that archaeologists find evidence for in the archaeological record of the second millennium before the Common Era. Egyptian records from various periods mention groups entering the Delta region from Canaan and the Sinai, seeking pasture and food, and returning when conditions improved. The broad social reality underlying the Genesis narrative has this thoroughly human and recognizable texture. And it is worth pausing here in the quiet to appreciate it. Beneath the theological weight of the tradition, there are real roads, real dust, real hunger and thirst, and the particular exhaustion of people who sleep in tents and wake to move on again. And yet the tradition insists that woven through all of this ordinary movement is something else, a thread of promise that the years and the journeys are slowly drawing out. Later in the Genesis narrative, in the account known to scholars as the covenant between the pieces, or the covenant of the deep sleep, Abram is brought outside into the night, and he is shown the sky, and the account says that he was asked to count the stars, if he could count them. And his descendants, the account tells him, will be like that. Abram looked up at the stars of the ancient Levant, stars unobscured by any electric light, burning with a clarity and density that we can barely imagine now. The full, unpolluted darkness of a night sky somewhere between the Jordan and the sea, and the promise was given to him in the language of that infinite, uncountable light. Historians note that covenant rituals of this kind, involving the halving of animals, the passing of symbolic elements between the pieces, have parallels in other ancient Near Eastern treaty traditions, ways of formalizing agreements between unequal parties by means of solemn ceremony and shared imagery. The tradition placed this covenant in a particular night, a particular darkness, a particular sky full of stars, and it is a scene that has remained vivid across millennia precisely because it speaks to something so immediate and sensory. The act of looking up, of being asked to reckon with immensity, and of finding in that immensity not emptiness, but promise. Abram lay down, the account says, and a deep sleep fell upon him, and in that sleep the covenant was made, and the stars remained above him, steady and ancient and innumerable as they had always been, and as they would continue to be long after the wanderer and his campfire and his tent were gone. Tomorrow night, if you journey further with this story, we will find ourselves moving deeper into the human texture of these Genesis lives, toward a woman who walked alone into the desert, and toward the quiet, extraordinary moment when water was found in a dry and lonely place. The desert at midday holds a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of heat, of light so bright it presses down like a hand upon the stone and sand, silencing even the insects, stilling even the dry grasses that fringe the wadis. It is into this silence that one of the most tender and quietly remarkable stories in all of Genesis moves. A story not of the great patriarchs and their covenants, but of a woman alone, a woman in flight, a woman sitting beside water she had not expected to find. Her name was Hagar, and the account tells us she was Egyptian, a servant in the household of Sarai and Abram. How she came to be there, the tradition does not say in any detail. It is said by some later commentators that she may have been among those given to Abram during his time in Egypt, in that earlier chapter of wandering that brought the family briefly to the banks of the Nile. However she arrived, she is there in the narrative fully formed, a real presence, a woman with her own interior life, even though the text grants us only glimpses of it, glimpses enough. The world of that household in the ancient Levant would have been a world of tents and hearthstones, of goats and grinding stones, of water carried in skins from the nearest well, and food prepared slowly over small fires whose smoke rose straight up in the still morning air. A household of any standing in the pastoral Bronze Age Levant was a complex thing, not merely a family, but a cluster of lives, servants and herders and their children, all moving together across the landscape in the long seasonal rhythms of a people not yet settled, not yet fixed to any particular patch of ground. Hagar would have known this life intimately, would have known the smell of the fire at dawn, the weight of the water jar, the sound of the camp waking around her in the blue half-light before the sun cleared the eastern hills. According to the account in Genesis, because Sarai had not conceived a child, she offered Hagar to Abram so that a child might be born through her, a practice that historians note was not unusual in the ancient Near East, a practice recognized in legal texts from Mesopotamia that predate the Genesis narratives by centuries. The law codes of the period understood and regulated such arrangements, which tells us something important about the world these stories lived in. They were not describing exotic or impossible customs, but the ordinary, sometimes painful realities of ancient family life. When Hagar conceived, the text says, she looked upon her mistress with changed eyes, and something strained and broke in the household. Sarai was harsh with her, the account says, simply and without elaboration, and Hagar fled. She fled toward the south and east, into the wilderness, a region that stretches between the settled lands of Canaan and the northeastern edge of Egypt, a dry and rocky landscape of limestone outcrops and shallow dried riverbeds, of thorn trees casting thin shadows on pale ground, of silence so complete that a person alone in it might feel both utterly abandoned and strangely, disconcertingly present to themselves. It is into this landscape, this bleached and breathless world, that the narrative places its first extraordinary moment. The account tells us that an angel of the Lord, and the Hebrew word here, malach, means simply messenger, found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, beside the spring on the way to Shur. Found her. The word implies she was not entirely lost, or that being found is not about geography, but about something else, something harder to name. The messenger asks her two questions. Where have you come from, and where are you going? She answers the first, but not the second, because she does not know the second. She is fleeing, which is always motion away from, rather than motion toward. The name given to that spring, Bir Lahai Roi, has been translated various ways over the centuries, but the most commonly offered rendering is something like the well of the living one who sees me, or the well of the one who lives and sees me. Hagar herself, the text tells us, gave a name to the God she felt she had encountered there, saying in the account as it has come down to us, "You are a God of seeing," and asking, in words of remarkable intimacy, "Have I truly seen the one who sees me here?" Scholars of the Hebrew Bible have noted that this is the only place in Genesis where a human being gives a name to God rather than the other way around. Whatever one makes of the theological dimensions of that moment, historically and literarily, it places Hagar in a position of extraordinary dignity. She is a woman, a servant, a foreigner, a fugitive, and she is the one naming the divine. The spring would have been a real kind of place in that landscape. Ancient travelers across the Negev and Sinai knew the thin seeps of water that collected in rock crevices, the shallow pools that formed after rains and persisted for weeks or months in hollows of stone, the permanent springs that marked the known routes between settlements like green punctuation marks in the brown grammar of the desert. Water in that world was not a convenience, but a border between life and everything else, and to find it unexpectedly was to feel, whatever one's beliefs, something very close to grace. Hagar returns to the household, and in time her son is born, and Abram names him Ishmael, a name the account explains as meaning God hears, because the tradition says the Lord had heard her affliction in the wilderness. The child grows in a household that is now quietly complicated. Years pass in the slow way years passed in that world, marked not by calendars, but by seasons of rain and dry, by the migrations of the flocks, by the gradual lengthening of a child into a young person capable of helping with the work of the camp. Then comes the second departure into the wilderness, and this one is harder to read without feeling something of its weight. After Isaac is born to Sarah, and this later in the narrative, after the visitors at Mamre have brought their astonishing news, the account tells us that Sarah saw Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar the Egyptian, and was troubled, and asked Abraham to send them away. The text records Abraham's distress at this. He did not do it easily. The account says God told him to listen to Sarah's voice, that through Isaac his line would be named, and that the son of the servant woman would also become a nation, because he was Abraham's offspring. Abraham rose early, and took bread and a skin of water, and gave them to Hagar, and sent her away. The economy of that sentence is heartbreaking in its plainness. Bread and a skin of water. Two things, not a household, not a flock, not servants of her own. Two things for the wilderness. She wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, and when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes, and went and sat down opposite him, at a distance of about a bowshot, for she said to herself, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And she lifted up her voice, and wept. The thorn bushes of the Negev in the northern Sinai are sparse, low, offering almost no shade, yet they are the only shade there is. She sat in the sun, she sat in the merciless, pressing, silent heat of the desert midday, at a distance, because she could not watch, and then the account turns again toward water. The tradition says that God heard the voice of the boy, that a messenger called to Hagar and asked her what troubled her, and told her not to be afraid, that the child would become a great nation. And then the account offers one of its plainest and most quietly beautiful sentences. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. She had been sitting within sight of water, and could not see it. Whether one understands that as miracle or as the fog of grief and despair that narrows human perception until nothing remains, the image carries something true about the experience of extremity, that sometimes what saves us has been there all along, waiting for the moment when we are able to receive it. The boy grew, the text says simply. He lived in the wilderness. He became an archer. His mother found him a wife from the land of Egypt, her own country, a thread of home drawn out across the dry hills. And the story of Hagar is the story of water found twice in the same wilderness, of being seen, of a name given in gratitude beside a spring. Let that image rest with you now as the night deepens around you. The still surface of water in a hollow of pale stone, the silence of a desert at the end of a long day, and a woman who was seen, who named what saw her, and who carried that knowing forward. In the hills nearby, the tents of a large and tangled household glow softly with firelight, and soon the narrative will draw its gaze upward toward the horizon, where three figures are walking toward Abraham on a warm afternoon at Mamre, carrying news that will change everything again. The heat of the day had reached its deepest, most settled stillness, the kind that presses down on the land like a warm hand laid flat upon the earth. When the account places Abraham, the name the tradition has given him now, changed from Abram in an earlier passage, sitting at the entrance of his tent beneath the great trees of Mamre. The oaks of Mamre are mentioned in the text with a quiet particularity, as though the storyteller knew those trees, knew the quality of shade they cast, knew the way their broad canopy held the air a little cooler than the open ground beyond. The hills of the southern Canaan uplands in the Middle Bronze Age would have looked not entirely unlike this. Terraced rock, pale limestone catching the white glare of afternoon, the occasional deep green of a tree that had found water somewhere below the surface, and drawn it patiently upward for decades. In that particular stillness, the kind in which even the birds go quiet, and the goats stand motionless in whatever shadow they can find, the account tells us that Abraham looked up and saw three men standing before him. The text does not linger on how they arrived or from which direction, or whether he had heard footsteps on the dry ground. They were simply there, as presences sometimes are in the oldest of stories, arriving between one breath and the next. And Abraham, in the manner of the ancient Near Eastern hospitality that archaeology and surrounding cultures confirm was both a custom and a deep moral obligation across this entire world, rose immediately and moved toward them. The account describes him running, and the detail carries something warm and unhurried in its warmth. An old man, for by this point in the narrative he is described as old, lifting his robes and moving quickly toward strangers, because strangers at your threshold were guests, and guests were sacred. The surrounding traditions of the ancient Levant and Mesopotamia held hospitality not merely as politeness, but as something close to a cosmic duty. The traveler in the desert needed water and food and rest as matters of life, and the giving of those things was an act that ordered the world correctly. Abraham bows, and his words as the account renders them are gracious and humble. He asks only that they might rest, that water might be brought for their feet, that bread might be set before them. The actual household economy suggested here is one of relative wealth. He speaks to Sarah in the tent, asks her to prepare cakes from fine meal, goes himself to the herd and selects a calf that is described as tender and good, and sets butter and milk alongside the prepared meat. Scholars of the ancient world note that the offering of curds and milk alongside meat reflects a pastoral nomadic diet of considerable richness, and that the speed and generosity of the preparation points to a household that could afford abundance, even in the heat of a Canaanite afternoon. Abraham stands near them beneath the tree while they eat, the account says, and there is something quietly beautiful in that image. The host standing in attendance, the dappled shade of the oak falling across the ground, the sound of a meal taken in the deep warmth of the day. And then one of the visitors speaks, and what he says carries the weight of the promise that is run through the Abraham narratives like a thread of light through dark fabric. He asks where Sarah is, and is told she is in the tent, and then the voice says that when the season returns, the phrase is translated variously, but its sense is something like the following spring, the time of life's renewal, Sarah will have a son. The account tells us that Sarah, inside the tent, heard this and laughed to herself. She is described as old, and Abraham is old, and the possibility seems to her beyond the edge of what the world allows. Her laughter is private, internal, and the account treats it with a gentleness that has always struck careful readers. There is no rebuke in the voice that follows, only a question, quiet and not unkind, asking why she laughed, asking whether anything is too difficult, and Sarah, a little frightened, says she did not laugh, and the voice says gently that she did. The exchange is brief and lit with something almost tender, and the promise stands unhurried, like a lamp that has been placed on a shelf and simply continues to burn. The three visitors rise and turn toward Sodom, and Abraham walks with them to set them on their way, as custom required. The narrative that follows has two distinct movements, and it is worth receiving them separately and gently. In the first, there is a long exchange in which Abraham speaks with one of the visitors, or with the presence the text identifies as the divine, about the fate of the cities of the plain. He asks, with a careful, almost lawyerly logic, whether a city might be spared if righteous people could be found within it. And he presses the number slowly downward, from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10, and each time the answer comes that yes, for 10 righteous souls, the city would be spared. There is something remarkable in the patience of this exchange, and theologians and scholars alike have noted that the Abraham of this passage is not passive or simply obedient, but engaged, questioning, pressing. The narrative presents it without apology, and the fact that it has been preserved and transmitted across millennia suggests that the ancient audience found it neither inappropriate nor surprising. The cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the others mentioned in the table of cities elsewhere in the text, are difficult to locate with archaeological certainty. Historians and geographers have debated their positions for generations, and the landscape of the southern end of the Dead Sea, with its salt flats and sulfur deposits, and evidence of ancient seismic activity, has drawn particular attention. Some researchers have pointed to sites at the eastern edge of the plain that show evidence of occupation in the relevant period, though the connections remain debated and the archaeology is careful to keep its conclusions measured. What is certain is that the region of the southern Levant carried its share of ancient upheaval, and that stories of catastrophic change in the landscape would have been natural to a people who had watched the earth shift in smoke. The second movement of the narrative involves Lot, Abraham's nephew, who has made his dwelling in Sodom. Two of the visitors come to him in the evening. The text has shifted, and now speaks of two, and Lot, like his uncle before him, rises to meet them, bows, and offers hospitality with urgency. He brings them to his house, bakes bread, and they eat. The account then describes a night of terrible pressure around the house, the men of the city demanding the strangers be given to them, Lot refusing, the visitors drawing Lot back inside and striking the crowd with a blindness that confuses and stills them. The visitors urge Lot and his household to leave before dawn. The account is not calm about what is described as happening in that city, but the sleep narration asks you simply to receive the narrative as it was given, a story of a place that had turned away from the obligations of hospitality and protection that were in the ancient world the bedrock of communal life. The destruction that follows is told in smoke and fire, in the image of Abraham looking from a distance and seeing the plain rising like the smoke of a furnace, and in the famous sad detail of Lot's wife looking back and becoming, the story says, a pillar of salt, a detail that the landscape of the Dead Sea region, with its extraordinary salt formations, may have prompted or preserved, as storytellers in every generation have noted when they looked at those pale columns standing at the water's edge. Lot and his daughters escape and settle in the hills, and the account traces forward a few more generations through a brief and uncomplicating passage before the narrative lifts its gaze and returns, slowly and gently, to Abraham and Sarah and the promise still burning quietly at the center of their lives. The smoke over the plain settles, the morning comes, the land is what it will now be. There is something in the progression of these chapters, hospitality, promise, departure, loss, survival, that has the shape of things that move through time without rushing. The oaks of Mamre stand in the memory of the narrative, the shade they cast on that long hot afternoon when three figures arrived, and a woman laughed inside a tent has been carried in the telling across so many centuries that it has become part of the furniture of human story. And ahead of Abraham and Sarah, in the slow unfolding of what the tradition promises, there is still a child to be born, a name to be given, a mountain to be climbed, and a grief to be grieved. But all of that waits with patience, as the next movement of the story rests, soft and unlit, like a lamp flame before it has been touched. The fire is small tonight, banked low against the cool air, its warmth pressing gently outward into the dark, as though it were breathing, as though it too had settled in for the long hours before dawn. And it is into that quality of light, amber and patient, throwing soft shadows against the walls of memory, that the tradition brings us one of its most ancient and carefully held stories, a story that has been turned over in human hands for so many centuries that its surfaces are worn smooth, like river stone, like the thresholds of very old temples. The account tells of Abraham, in the fullness of his years, camped somewhere in the region the text names as Beersheba, a place of wells and oaths and the slow sandy wind that comes up from the south. Isaac is no longer an infant in this part of the story. The tradition does not name his age precisely, and historians have debated the matter gently for generations, some placing him as a boy of perhaps 10 or 12 years, others reading the later details of the account and suggesting he might have been a young man already, strong enough to carry a bundle of cut wood up the long slope of a mountain. The uncertainty is part of the story's texture, part of what makes it feel like something preserved across a very long time, like dried herbs that still carry their fragrance even when their original freshness is gone. The narrative, as it has come down to us, begins before the sun rises. Abraham wakes, and the fire that was burning the night before has perhaps burned down to coals, to soft orange light beneath a crust of gray ash, and the stars are still present in the sky above the camp, the same stars of the Levantine night that we have watched throughout all these long chapters of the patriarchal story. He saddles his donkey, a slow, unhurried act, the tightening of straps in the pre-dawn quiet, and he takes 2 young men from among his servants, and he takes Isaac his son, and he splits the wood for the offering himself, and the account says simply that he rose early and set out for the place that had been shown to him. The place is called Moriah in the tradition. It is a name that has gathered centuries of interpretation around it the way a stone gathers moss. Later traditions would identify Moriah with the great limestone ridge above Jerusalem, and the story has been carried forward in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic memory alike, each tradition holding it differently, each finding in it something particular to its own understanding of faith and obedience and the nature of the divine. But the earliest layers of the text are quiet on such specifics. The mountain is simply there, at a distance of 3 days' journey, rising out of the landscape as mountains do in these stories, not merely as geography but as threshold, as the kind of place where the ordinary world and something beyond it grow very close together. 3 days of walking, then, through the hills and the dry valleys and the pale dust of the ancient road. One can imagine the small sounds of that journey, the donkey's patient footfalls, the creak of the wood bundle, the voices of the 2 servants perhaps speaking quietly to one another as servants do, of ordinary things, of the evening meal, and the ache in their feet, and the color of the sky to the west. And Isaac walking beside his father, in the way that children walk beside very quiet parents, present but not quite certain what the quiet means. It is Isaac, the account tells us, who asks the question that has echoed down through all the centuries of interpretation. They are climbing now, the 2 of them, Abraham having left the servants behind, with the donkey at the foot of the hill. Abraham carries the fire, that small carried flame, a coal kept alive in some vessel, the same ancient technology of preservation that travelers across the Near East would have known well, and he carries the knife. And Isaac says to his father, "Here is the fire, and here is the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?" The answer Abraham gives is one of the most quietly resonant phrases in the whole of Genesis. The translation varies across traditions, but its essence is something like, "The divine will provide," and then the text says, with its characteristic ancient brevity, "and the 2 of them went on together." That detail, together, has moved readers and listeners across millennia. There's something in it that the narration does not explain and does not need to explain. Something held in the space between a father and a child walking up a mountain in the morning light. What happens at the summit of Moriah is the moment the tradition has preserved with the most care and the most debate. Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood, binds Isaac and raises the knife. And then, the account tells, a voice calls out from beyond the moment, and the action is stayed, and a ram is found caught by its horns in a thicket nearby, and it is the ram that becomes the offering. Historians and theologians across many centuries have read this passage as one of the most layered in all of ancient Near Eastern literature. Some scholars have seen in it a narrative that encodes a cultural or religious turning point, a tradition reflecting on the movement away from human sacrifice, a practice that existed in various forms across the ancient world, including among some of Israel's neighbors. Others have read it as a story about trust, about the willingness to give back what one has been given. Others still approach it with the tools of literary criticism, admiring its structure, its tension, its economy of language. The tradition itself simply holds the story open, like a hand holding a flame, letting each generation find in it what it finds. What is certain is that the story ends not in loss, but in presence. The ram, the thicket, the name Abraham gives to the place, a name that the text translates as something like the mountain where provision is seen, or where seeing happens. And then the long walk back down, the return to the servants, the journey south again to Beersheba, and the fire of the camp resumed, the ordinary world received again like a garment put back on after a long and strange immersion in cold water. And then the narrative moves, with the quiet abruptness that is so characteristic of Genesis, to a death. Sarah, who has been present at the edges of so many of these stories, who laughed at a promise, who sent Hagar into the wilderness, who received the strange and lovely news of Isaac's coming in her old age, Sarah dies in a place called Hebron, in the hill country of Canaan. The text gives her age as 127 years, which places her among the long-lived figures of the patriarchal world, and the account says simply that Abraham came to mourn for her and to weep for her. That simplicity carries great weight. This is a man who has walked through enormous landscapes, who has received and held and passed on extraordinary promises, and he sits beside his wife's body and weeps. What follows is one of the most domestic, legally grounded passages in the whole of Genesis, Abraham's careful negotiation with the people of Heth for a burial place. He asks to purchase a cave called Machpelah in the field of a man named Ephron, and the negotiations proceed with all the elaborate, courteous ceremony of ancient Near Eastern land transaction, the kind of exchange that archaeologists have recognized as following real legal conventions of the period. Ephron at first offers the land as a gift. Abraham insists on paying the full price. Silver is weighed out, 400 shekels. And the field and its cave become Abraham's, a piece of Canaan that is his own, the first ground in the promised land that he holds in permanent possession. It is a burial ground, a place for the dead, and yet even that has its tenderness. The idea that Sarah is laid to rest in the very land that the promise has always pointed toward, that her grave becomes a kind of rooting, a first anchor. The cave of Machpelah would become, according to the tradition, the resting place of the patriarchs and matriarchs in turn. Abraham himself, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, a family gathered slowly over generations in the same cool limestone chamber, while the world outside moved through its seasons and its slow changes. The fire of the living world continues as it always does, casting its warm light into the dark, and somewhere at the edge of the firelight, the next part of the story is already waiting, patient and unhurried, carrying in it the sound of a well being drawn, a camel kneeling in the dust, and the very first sight of a young woman walking out into the evening to meet a stranger who has come a long way with a question to ask. The road from Canaan to Mesopotamia was long and unpaved, a path worn into the earth by centuries of sandal and hoof, winding northward through dry hills and slow river valleys, past the shadowed mouths of wadis and the occasional dark shape of a carob tree standing alone against the pale sky. It was a road that traders knew, and herdsmen, and those who carried messages between one world and another. And it was on this road, according to the account that has come down to us, that an old and trusted servant set out one morning with 10 camels and a company of men, carrying with him gifts of silver and gold and garments, and a task that must have felt enormous in the quietness of departure, to find among strangers in a distant land a wife for the son of his master Abraham. We do not know the servant's name with certainty. The tradition does not give it here, though some have suggested, across the long centuries of commentary and reflection, that this was Eliezer, the same man mentioned briefly elsewhere in the Genesis narratives. Whoever he was, the account paints him as careful, faithful, and attuned to the small movements of the world around him, the kind of man who watches and waits and reads the signs of ordinary things with patient attention. Isaac himself had grown into the quietness that seems always to have surrounded him. He was the child of the promise, the boy born late in his parents' lives, the one who had lain on the stone of Moriah and descended from the mountains still breathing. The account tells us that after Sarah's death, that long mourning, that careful burial in the cave of Machpelah, Abraham turned his concern toward his son's solitude and to the matter of a wife. He did not want Isaac to take a wife from among the Canaanite peoples of the surrounding land, and so the servant was charged with returning to Mesopotamia, to the country and kindred from which Abraham himself had come, to find a suitable match. The caravans of the ancient Near East moved in this way across enormous distances, linking the great urban centers of the river valleys with the pastoral communities of the hill country and the coast. Mesopotamian trade goods, lapis lazuli from the mountains further east, tin and copper worked into tools and ornaments, fine textiles from the workshops of cities along the Euphrates, made their slow way through exactly these routes, and the servant with his 10 camels would have been a familiar enough sight to other travelers on the road, though his errand was perhaps more delicate than most. The account lingers with particular care on the moment of arrival at the city of Nahor, which many scholars associate with the region of Haran in what is now southern Turkey, the same Haran where Abraham had rested for years before continuing southwest toward Canaan. The servant arrives in the evening, and he brings his camels to rest near the well outside the city at the hour when the women come to draw water. And this detail, the well at evening, the sound of water drawn up from the deep dark earth, belongs to something larger in the Genesis tradition, a pattern so consistent it seems almost like a kind of grammar, a recurring image in the language of these stories. Wells in the ancient Levant and Mesopotamia were not merely practical things, though they were certainly that. In a landscape where water could be scarce, where the difference between a good season and a desperate one might come down to what lay beneath the surface of the ground, a well was a place of profound significance. It was a place of gathering, of exchange, of encounter. The women who came to draw water in the evenings brought with them the accumulated life of their households, the need of the day, the news of the village, the rhythms of family and work. To meet someone at a well was to meet them in a moment of ordinary necessity, which is perhaps the most honest kind of meeting there is. The servant, the account tells us, prays quietly beside the well. He asks for a sign, specific and particular. Let the young woman who not only offers him water to drink, but offers also to draw water for his camels, let her be the one meant for Isaac. Camels drink deeply and slowly after a long journey. To offer to water 10 of them would be no small thing. It would require effort and time and a kind of generous attention to the needs of strangers. And almost before he has finished forming the thought, according to the account, Rebekah comes to the well with her jar on her shoulder. What the archaeology of the period can tell us is this: the world Rebekah inhabited was a world of extended family structures, of patrilineal households, where marriage arrangements were serious matters negotiated with great care between families. The women of these communities were not without agency or voice. The Genesis tradition itself is notably attentive to the moments when women speak and choose, but marriage was understood as an alliance between groups as much as a union between individuals, and the blessing and agreement of the family was essential. When the servant speaks to Rebekah and then to her family, offering his gifts, recounting his errand, explaining who he is and who has sent him, he is following the careful protocols of a world in which such negotiations required patience and ceremony and the proper acknowledgement of every person with a stake in the outcome. The family, her father Bethuel, and especially her brother Laban, whose presence in the narrative is large, and whose character the tradition will develop with considerable complexity in the chapters still to come. Listens and considers and agrees. The gifts are given, there is eating and drinking, and a resting in the house, and then the servant asks to leave quickly, to take Rebekah and return to Canaan. And it is here that the account includes a small, luminous moment that has stayed in the imagination of readers for millennia. The family asks whether Rebekah might remain with them a few days more before departing, and the servant asks that they not delay him, and so they ask Rebekah herself. She says, "I will go." 2 words in some translations, a sentence that fits in a breath, but it carries the weight of everything that follows: the crossing of hundreds of miles of road, the arrival in a strange land, the meeting with a man she has never seen. The account of that meeting is told with a quietness that matches the landscape it describes. Isaac had gone out into the fields in the evening to walk, to meditate, some translations say, though the precise meaning of the Hebrew word has been a subject of scholarly discussion for a long time. He was in the Negev, in the open country south of Canaan, where the lighted evening comes in long and golden across the scrub and stone. He looked up and saw the caravan approaching. Rebekah looked up and saw a man walking toward her across the field, and she asked the servant who he was, and when she heard, she covered her face with her veil. And Isaac brought her into his mother's tent, and he loved her, and the account says that she was a comfort to him after his mother's death. There is something very human in that detail, something that reaches across the enormous distance of time and culture to touch something recognizable. Grief and comfort, the slow healing that comes through the presence of another person, these things do not change in their essence, whatever changes in the forms they take. The wells of Genesis appear again and again in these stories, quiet and persistent as an underground stream. It is at a well that Jacob will meet Rachel, in the chapter that waits just ahead. It is beside water that so many of these first encounters happen, as though the tradition understood that the most important meetings in a life tend to occur in the ordinary places, in the middle of necessary work, at the hour of evening when the light is soft and the day is easing toward its rest. For now, the servant's journey is complete. The 10 camels are resting. The road back to Canaan has been traveled. Isaac walks in the fields at dusk, and the long caravan of a life that will carry its own sorrows and its own gifts moves gently forward. Let that image rest with you for a moment. The open fields, the low golden light, 2 people walking toward each other across the quiet land, the sound of the evening wind moving through dry grasses. There is no hurry now. There is only the stillness of arrival, and the soft, unhurried dark gathering at the edges of the world. Let it carry you down into rest. The hills of Canaan hold their warmth long after the sun has gone, the stone releasing the day's heat slowly into the cooling dark, the way an old fire gives back its last breath of warmth to the air around it. Shepherds know this, and so did the wandering households of the patriarchs, who camped in the highlands and listened each evening to the sounds of flocks settling, of children quieting, of fires being coaxed from the same kinds of tinder their grandparents had known. It is in this world, unhurried and ancient, that the account places the household of Isaac and Rebekah, and in their tent 2 boys are born who will shape the long remainder of the Genesis story. The tradition tells us that Rebekah's pregnancy was difficult, that the 2 children struggled within her even before their birth, and that when she sought understanding for what she felt, she received a word that has echoed through the centuries of interpretation. 2 nations, the story says, were within her, and the elder would serve the younger. This detail, quietly placed at the beginning of the twins' story, colors everything that follows, and scholars have long observed that the narrative carries within it not only the story of 2 brothers, but the memory of 2 peoples, the Israelites and the Edomites, whose histories would intertwine and conflict across the long centuries of the Iron Age Levant. But the account keeps its focus on the immediate and the personal, on 2 boys growing up in the same tent, eating from the same fire, and yet becoming in every visible way quite different from one another. Esau is described as the first to emerge, red and covered with hair, a figure who from his earliest days inclined toward the open country, the hills, the patient work of hunting. Jacob followed, and the account preserves a detail so strange and tender that it has stayed in the memory of readers across thousands of years. He came out grasping the heel of his brother, so that his very name, Jacob, carried within it the word for heel, and also the shadow meaning of one who supplants, or follows closely, or perhaps reaches for what is ahead of him. The ancients listened for meaning in names, the way we listen for melody in familiar songs, and this name with its doubled meaning set the tone for all that followed. The boys grew, and their differences deepened. Esau became a man of the fields, skilled in hunting, bringing back game from the rough country beyond the camp, and the account tells us that Isaac loved him and delighted in what he brought home. Jacob, by contrast, was a quieter figure, one who stayed among the tents, who learned the work of the encampment, and who seems to have been closer to his mother's world. Rebekah, the account says, loved Jacob, and here the household of Isaac becomes a place of divided affections, not painted with bitterness, but noted with the calm and honest eye of a very old story that knows how complicated love within families can become. It is in this atmosphere that the first great episode between the brothers unfolds. Esau returned from the field exhausted, the story says, hollow with hunger, and found Jacob cooking a thick red stew, lentils perhaps, or something equally warming and heavy. He asked for it urgently, and Jacob, in a move that later readers have found troubling or cunning, depending on their angle of view, offered the stew in exchange for Esau's birthright, the elder son's portion of inheritance and standing. Esau, in his hunger, agreed and ate, and the account closes that small scene with a note that sounds almost like a sigh. He ate and drank and rose and went his way, and so he despised his birthright. The tradition does not linger here, does not dramatize the moment, but lets it settle into memory like a stone dropped into still water. Years passed, in the way that Genesis years pass, slowly, and with the weight of ordinary life folded into them. Isaac grew old, and his eyes grew dim, and the moment arrived when he wished to give his formal blessing to Esau, the firstborn, before he died. He called Esau to him and asked him to go out into the field and bring back game, to make the food he loved, and then receive the blessing. But Rebekah had heard, and the account tells us that she moved quickly. She called Jacob, laid out what she had heard, and formed a plan. Jacob would go to the flock, bring her 2 young goats. She would prepare them in the way Isaac loved, and Jacob would go to his father in Esau's place and receive the blessing first. Jacob's hesitation in the account is not moral, but practical. He worried that his father would touch him and find him smooth where Esau was rough, that he would be discovered and cursed rather than blessed. Rebekah answered that she would take that curse upon herself. And so she dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, placed the skins of the young goats on his hands and on the smooth of his neck, and sent him into his father. What follows is one of the Genesis narrative's most intimate scenes, a blind old man and his son in a tent, the smell of the field on the clothes, the voice that sounds like Jacob, but the hands that feel like Esau. Isaac blessed Jacob, the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth, lordship over brothers. And when Esau returned shortly after, the truth could not be undone. The account gives Esau a cry, bitter and great, and Isaac trembled, and the blessing once given could not in the tradition's understanding be recalled. Historians and scholars who study the ancient Near East have noted that blessing in this world was understood as something real and active, not merely a form of words. Once released, it belonged to its recipient. The customs surrounding inheritance and firstborn rights were complex and varied across the ancient Levant, and there is evidence from texts discovered at places like Nuzi that adoption, inheritance transfers, and the complexities of birth order were living legal and social questions in this period. The Genesis account reflects a world where these things carried genuine weight, where what happened in a tent between a father and his sons could shape the lives of generations. Esau's grief is presented without softening, and his anger turned toward his brother. He intended, the story goes, to wait until his father's death and then deal with Jacob, and Rebekah heard of this as well. She called Jacob again and told him to flee, to go northward to Haran, to her brother Laban's house, and wait there until his brother's fury cooled. Isaac sent him away with a second blessing, and Jacob left, alone now, with no flock, no household, no company, and began to walk northward under the wide sky of Canaan. The account then places him at a certain unnamed place as the sun went down, and Jacob took a stone from the ground and laid it beneath his head and lay down to sleep. Here the narrative shifts into something altogether quieter and stranger, the way the note of a flute will change as the player climbs toward a higher register. Jacob slept, and in his sleep he dreamed, and the dream the account gives him has become one of the most enduring images in the entire Genesis story. He saw a ladder, or a stairway as some translations and interpreters have rendered it, set up on the earth, with its top reaching into heaven, and on it the angels of God were ascending and descending, and at the top, the account says, stood one who spoke to him with words that echo the earlier promises made to Abraham and to Isaac, the land, the descendants, the blessing that would spread to all the families of the earth. Some scholars have drawn comparisons between this vision and the great stepped temple towers of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats that rose in stages toward the sky, places understood as meeting points between the divine and the human world. Whether Jacob's dreaming mind was shaped by such images carried in cultural memory, or whether the account is drawing on older traditions of sacred mountains and ascending messengers, the image remains one of extraordinary peace, a lonely sleeper on the ground, the stars above him, and a brightness reaching from earth to heaven and back again. Jacob woke, and the account says he was afraid, but it was a reverent kind of fear, the kind that comes not from danger, but from having been in the presence of something vast and real. He took the stone he had slept on and stood it upright and called the place Bethel, house of God, and made a quiet vow that if this presence would go with him and bring him back safely, then this stone would be a sacred place, and he would return something of all he was given. Then he lifted his feet and went on, northward, toward the household of Laban and the years that waited for him there, carrying with him the weight of the stolen blessing and the brightness of the dream, both of them woven together now into the cloth of his life. The fire in the camp behind him would have burned low through the night, its embers holding their warmth against the cool air, glowing softly without anyone to tend them, the way some things continue their quiet work long after we have fallen into sleep. The road north from Canaan was long, and Jacob had walked it carrying almost nothing. Only the memory of his dream at Bethel, the stone he had anointed with oil still behind him in the dark, and ahead of him the uncertain shape of a future he could not yet see. By the time he arrived at the well near Haran, the account tells us, he was a man arriving at the edge of a new life, though he did not yet know how many years that life would take to unfold, or how slowly the seasons would turn in his uncle's country, before he would be permitted to turn homeward again. The well, as so often in the Genesis narratives, is where the story gathers itself. It is a round stone mouth in the dry ground, and around it the flocks of several shepherds have gathered, waiting for the stone to be rolled away so that the animals might drink. Jacob speaks with the shepherds and learns that they are from Haran, that they know a man named Laban, and that even now a young woman is approaching with her father's sheep. Laban's daughter, Rachel, whose name means ewe, who is herself a figure of pastoral grace coming toward the well in the afternoon light. The account is unhurried here, as if it knows that what is about to begin will take a very long time, and it allows the reader to linger at the well's edge, in the dust and the warmth, before the meeting takes place. When Jacob sees Rachel, he rolls the stone from the mouth of the well himself, and then he weeps. The tradition does not explain the weeping entirely, and historians and readers across the millennia have wondered at it, whether it was exhaustion or relief at reaching a place of kinship after so long a road, or something else entirely, some recognition in the heart that the long journey was, for a time, over. He waters the flock, and he tells Rachel who he is, and she runs to tell her father, and Laban comes out to meet him with the warmth of a man greeting family, embracing him and bringing him inside the house. Laban's house in Haran sits in the landscape of northern Mesopotamia, in a region the ancient sources associate with a broader Aramaean cultural world, a world of pastoralists and small settlements, of flocks and tents and seasonal rhythms, of men who measured their wealth in animals and counted their years in lambing seasons and harvest times. Archaeology has found traces of this world in the cities and settlements of the upper Euphrates region, where trade routes crossed and family networks stretched across great distances, and where a young man from Canaan might indeed have found his mother's kin still living in the old country from which her family had come. Jacob enters this world and stays within it, and the account allows us to feel the way it gradually becomes ordinary to him. The particular smell of Laban's household, the texture of the work, the slow pulse of days that are, after the drama of his departure from home, largely quiet and accumulative. After a month, Laban asks Jacob what his wages should be, and Jacob answers with Rachel's name. He will work 7 years for the right to marry her, and the account says, in one of its most quietly beautiful lines, that those 7 years seemed to him like only a few days because of the love he had for her. It is a line that has been carried in human memory for a very long time, and it breathes gently across the page even now. 7 years of labor made light by feeling, time moving differently for a man who has something he is moving toward. The wells of Haran would have been filled and emptied 1,000 times in those years, the flocks growing and thinning with the seasons, the rhythm of the pastoral calendar setting its steady pace across Jacob's days. But when the 7 years are complete, and Jacob asks for his wife, the story takes a turn that the tradition recounts with remarkable directness. Laban substitutes Leah, his elder daughter, for Rachel on the wedding night, and Jacob does not discover this until morning. What follows is complicated and, to a modern reader, troubling. The account does not soften it, and historians note that it reflects a world in which women's choices in such arrangements were severely constrained, and in which the structures of family alliance could override individual feeling in ways that are difficult now to imagine clearly. Laban's explanation is simply that in his country the younger daughter is not given before the elder, a reversal, the tradition quietly suggests, that echoes Jacob's own story of the younger displacing the elder, now working itself out in the opposite direction. Jacob agrees to work another 7 years for Rachel, and within the week he receives her also as his wife, though Leah remains, and the household that will grow from this arrangement is already taking on its complicated shape. Rachel and Leah are sisters married to the same man, and between them there runs a thread of rivalry and longing that the account traces with considerable human tenderness. Leah bears children and is unloved. Rachel is loved and for a long time bears no children. The pain on both sides is rendered carefully, Leah naming her sons with names that express her longing to be seen and held, Rachel weeping to Jacob that she will die if she does not have children, Jacob answering with a helplessness that the text does not entirely excuse, but does present as honest. Into this household come also Zilpah, Leah's servant, and Bilhah, Rachel's servant, who also bear children by Jacob, a practice that the ancient Near Eastern world recognized within certain social structures, and that the Genesis account narrates as part of the complicated, layered reality of a large patriarchal household assembling itself one child at a time. Sons arrive one after another, and each name is given with a story, a meaning, a small linguistic thread connecting the child to the emotional world of his mother at the moment of his birth. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Leah's sons, the names carrying sounds of sight and hearing and belonging. Dan and Naphtali from Bilhah, Gad and Asher from Zilpah, then Issachar, Zebulun, a daughter named Dinah, and finally at last, Rachel's firstborn Joseph, whose arrival is described with a quiet joy that feels like sunlight coming through after a long overcast stretch of years. The account also tells of Jacob's dealings with Laban over wages and flocks in those later years, a story of selective breeding, an accumulation that the text narrates as both shrewd and divinely assisted, in which Jacob's household gradually grows wealthy, while Laban's sons begin to watch him with something less than warmth. It is the story of a man slowly outgrowing the container of another man's household, of a life becoming too large for the arrangement that first held it. Jacob has arrived with nothing. He is leaving when the time comes, with wives and children and servants and flocks, and the long weight of 14 years pressed into his shoulders. 14 years is a long time, long enough for a boy to become a man, for a man's hair to silver at the edges, for a household to go from 2 hands in a sleeping roll to a small village moving together across the land. The account compresses those years. It does not show us every lambing, every argument, every evening meal taken in the long shadows of the Haran hills, but it leaves enough space between the lines for the imagination to fill in the texture of ordinary time. The wells that Jacob drew from would have become familiar to him as old friends. The stars over Haran, spread out in their enormous ancient silence above the flat rooftops and the sheep pens, would have become the stars he knew rather than the stars of his childhood in Canaan. A man can make a home anywhere, and for 14 years this was his. And yet the tradition is clear that it was never entirely home. Something in Jacob always faced southward and westward, toward the land of his father and the promise that had been named to him in a dream on a stone pillow at Bethel. The agreement with Laban, the marriages, the children, all of these were real and full and present, but underneath them, like a river moving quietly beneath flat ground, there was the knowledge that the story was not finished here. It was accumulating, the way a river accumulates, gathering everything it passes through into itself, carrying it forward. And so the years at Laban's house draw toward their close, not with violence or sudden drama, but with the quiet pressure of a life that has grown too large for one place, and a man beginning to turn his face toward the road. The children sleep in their tents. Rachel and Leah lie in the dark. The flocks breathe softly in the night air of Haran, and somewhere above them all, the stars of the ancient Levantine sky burn with the same patient, unhurried fire that Jacob first saw on the night he laid his head on a stone and dreamed of a ladder, and heard a voice speaking his name in the dark. The road south felt different beneath Jacob's feet than the road north had, all those years before. When he had fled from Canaan as a young man, the ground had seemed to move away from him with every step, receding like something withdrawn, like a gift taken back before it could be properly held. He had slept on bare earth with a stone beneath his head, and seen, according to the tradition, a ladder bright with moving figures, and he had woken with the dew on his face and the enormous silence of the open plateau around him. That had been the beginning of his long sojourn in the north, in the household of Laban, in the country between the rivers, where the wind came off the plain in long, slow gusts that smelled of dust and distance. Now, after 14 years and more, after all the accumulating weight of wives and children and flocks, and the slow, complicated business of becoming a man of substance rather than a fugitive, Jacob was turning south again. He was going home, and the road carried its own particular quality of fear. The Jabbok River lies in what is now the country east of the Jordan, a tributary that cuts down through folded hills in a series of sharp limestone gorges before emptying itself into the great river to the west. The Hebrew name Jabbok has a sound like the rushing of water over stones, and in the ancient geography of the region, the Jabbok marked a significant boundary, a place where territories changed and names sometimes changed with them. To cross the Jabbok was in the logic of the landscape itself, to enter a different world. Travelers in that region would have known the sound of it at night, that continuous murmuring conversation the water held with its own banks, filling the air with white noise that made the darkness feel both deeper and somehow less threatening, as though the river were thinking aloud on behalf of everything that moved through the dark. Jacob had sent his household across ahead of him. The account tells of a man of considerable care and practical intelligence, whatever else the tradition preserves about him. He had organized his approach to Esau's territory with the elaborate diplomacy of someone who knows he is in the wrong and is trying to make it right without quite saying so. Gifts were sent ahead in careful sequence, droves of goats and rams and camels and cattle, each wave of animals arriving before the next, each one accompanied by servants carrying a message of conciliation. The older brother who had threatened to kill him had become in the intervening years a man of his own substance, a chief among the people of the hill country to the south, and Jacob was approaching him not as a younger brother slipping back under cover of darkness, but as a returning patriarch meeting an equal, or so he hoped. But first there was the night at the Jabbok to be endured. He had sent his wives and his children and all his servants across the ford, watching them make their way through the dark water, listening to the soft sounds of the crossing, the splash of feet, the murmur of voices, the high brief cry of a child startled by the cold. And then he was alone. The night settled around him with the particular density that comes when one has been for a long time surrounded by people and noise in the ordinary business of a large household, and then suddenly is not. The river moved and spoke to itself in the darkness below. The stars were present in their thousands in the way that stars are visible in desert country, not as points, but almost as a texture, a fine silver grain across the whole breadth of the sky. And then, according to the tradition, A man came out of the dark and wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. This is one of the passages in the Genesis text that has generated more contemplation and more careful questioning scholarship than perhaps any other, and it is worth dwelling in it slowly without hurry, as one might sit beside a river one does not quite understand, but finds oneself unable to leave. The Hebrew account does not initially identify the figure. He arrives simply as a man, an Ish, and the encounter is physical, exhausting, immediate. Two figures in the dark by a river, locked together through the long hours of the night, while the water ran on below them, and the stars moved their slow arc overhead. Historians and theologians across millennia have read this passage through different lenses, as a divine encounter, as a psychological reckoning, as a memory of an ancient boundary spirit, as a dream that the text renders in the language of waking experience. None of these readings quite explains the strangeness away, and perhaps that is the point. The tradition has carried this story forward precisely because it refuses to be made entirely comfortable. What the account preserves is a sense of genuine struggle. Jacob, who had always been the one who grasped. The name itself is connected in the Hebrew wordplay the text loves to the word for heel, for grasping, for holding on, was now in a contest that lasted all night without resolution. The figure could not prevail against him, the text says, and there is something in that phrase worth resting with. The idea that Jacob, frightened and alone by a river in the dark, held on through the whole long turning of the night. When the dawn began to come, gray and slow above the eastern ridges, the stranger touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and the hip was put out of joint, and even then Jacob did not let go. He held on with the desperation of a man who understands, perhaps for the first time, that this encounter is unlike anything the world has previously offered him. "Let me go," the figure said, "for the day is breaking." And Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The exchange that follows has a quality of extraordinary tenderness beneath its strangeness. The stranger asks for Jacob's name, and Jacob gives it, the name that means the grasper, the supplanter, the one who works by holding tight to the heel of the one ahead. And the answer comes back that his name will no longer be Jacob but Israel, for he has striven with God and with men and has prevailed. The word Yisrael carries in it a wrestling, a contending, a persisting, and it became the name by which the tradition would identify not just this one man, but the entire people who understood themselves as his descendants. A name given in the dark by a river, carried forward across 3,000 years or more of human memory and history and collective identity. The weight of that, considered quietly in the still hours of the night, is considerable. Jacob asked the stranger's name and received no answer, only a question in return, and then a blessing, and then the figure was gone, and the sun was rising, and Jacob was limping, the joint of his hip altered by the night's encounter, and he called the place Peniel, the face of God, saying that he had seen God face to face, and his life had been preserved. Whether one reads this theologically or archaeologically or as literature, there is something in the landscape of the story itself that rings true to the experience of the river crossings of that region. Those moments of physical threshold, of night passage, of arriving on the other side changed, and not quite certain how. And then, as the morning came fully on, Esau appeared. He came from the south with 400 men at his back, which might have been an army or might have been his household, and Jacob went ahead of his family, limping forward, bowing 7 times to the ground, in the formal gesture of submission that the ancient Near East understood well. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell upon his neck and wept. And Jacob wept. 20 years of separation and anger and fear, dissolved in a moment of salt and embrace, and the simple fact of 2 old men who had once been boys together on the same hillside, under the same sky, watching the same flocks. The account tells of gifts offered and gently declined and offered again, of the practical negotiations of 2 large households finding ways to exist in proximity, of the careful geography of parting, each man moving to his own territory, each carrying his own name and his own blessing forward. It is said that Jacob settled his household at Succoth, east of the river, before moving further into Canaan, and that he purchased a piece of ground near the city of Shechem and erected an altar, and called it by a name that means God, the God of Israel. The man who had left with a staff and a stone and a frightened heart came back with children and flocks, and a limp and a new name. And the land that had once receded from him beneath his running feet was still there, patient as limestone, patient as the stars, patient as the river that speaks all night to its own banks and asks nothing in return. The Jabbok runs on in the dark, its water the same water it has always been, carrying its particular voice down through the gorges toward the Jordan, as it did the night a man held on until the dawn and found himself, in the holding, changed, and in the hills above, the tents of a great household were being set up by tired and capable hands. Fires laid, children settled, the ordinary world resuming around the extraordinary moment that had passed, while all around them the wide, breathing dark of Canaan waited, full of rivers and memory, and the patient lives of all the people who were yet to come. The hills of Canaan breathe slowly in the early morning, before the heat arrives and the air thickens with the smell of dust and dried grass. There is a moment, just after the sun has cleared the ridge to the east, and before the herds have begun to move, when the whole landscape seems to hold itself very still, the limestone slopes catching the first warmth, the olive trees standing silver and quiet along the terraces, the sky above them a pale and luminous blue, not yet committed to the full brightness of the day. It is into this stillness that we arrive now, setting down our traveling for a little while, simply to rest here among the hills and breathe the air of a world that existed long before anyone thought to write it down. The account has brought us a long way already. We have followed Jacob across rivers and back again, watched him wrestle in the dark, heard the new name settle over him like a garment. We have seen him reunited with the brother he feared, and we have watched him make his way, gradually, and with the unhurried pace of a man who has learned patience through long years, back into the land that was promised to his grandfather. And now the tradition shows us Jacob settled, or as settled as a pastoral household ever truly was, among the hills and valleys of Canaan, with his tents and his flocks, and his wells and his children around him. This is a good moment to be still, to look around, to simply feel where we are. The sons of Jacob were 12, according to the account, born of 4 different women across those long years in Haran and on the road between. Reuben was the firstborn, and then Simeon and Levi and Judah, children of Leah, who had loved Jacob with a patient and unreciprocated love through many years of his life. Then came the sons of the handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, whose names the tradition preserves with care, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. And Leah bore more sons still, Issachar and Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah, whose story the account tells with a grief and a heaviness that speaks of real and ancient wounds. And finally Rachel, the beloved, gave Jacob 2 sons, Joseph, who arrived before they left Haran, and Benjamin, whose birth came at great cost on the road south, near Bethlehem, where Rachel died and was buried by the way. 12 sons, a daughter, the household that would become, in the long memory of this tradition, the 12 tribes of a people. But here now, in the hills of Canaan, they are simply a family, complicated, numerous, restless, bound together by blood and divided by the smaller and larger grievances that accumulate in any large household over years. They are herdsmen and their sons, moving between the pastures as the seasons require, following the rhythm of water and grass that has shaped this landscape for thousands of years before them. The archaeology of this region, in the centuries that historians associate with the patriarchal period, the Middle Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the long transition between them, suggests a way of life that was neither entirely nomadic nor entirely settled, but something in between, something fluid and responsive to the land. Small villages dotted the highlands, clusters of stone-built rooms around central courtyards where animals were kept and grain was stored. But many families, especially those whose wealth lay in their herds, moved seasonally between the highlands and the lower valleys, between the rain-fed pastures of winter and the drier upland grazing of summer. They carried with them their tents and their tools, their lamps and their cookpots, their knowledge of wells and springs, and the small, reliable pools that formed in limestone hollows after rain. Jacob's household, as the account describes it, was a large one, not a lone family but a small community, with servants and herders, and all the complicated social fabric that such a group implies. The tents would have been made of dark goat hair cloth, stretched over wooden poles and pinned to the ground with pegs, warm in the cool nights and shaded in the heat of the day. Inside, the space would have been divided, a place for the women and children, a place for guests, a place for sleeping and eating and the small daily rituals of life. Cooking was done over open fires, with pots of clay or bronze, with flatbreads laid on heated stones, with the smell of smoke and roasting grain, and the particular rich smell of boiled lentils or stewed meat drifting out across the camp in the evening hours. The flocks would have been mostly sheep and goats, the animals that have shaped this landscape more than any other, cropping the hillside grasses and the scrubby low bushes, their bells sounding across the valleys in the early morning when the herders drove them out to pasture. Donkeys carried loads along the roads and between the villages, patient and sure-footed on the stony paths. There may have been cattle too, though cattle require more water and richer pasture than the dry Canaanite hills easily provide. The care of these animals was the work of the sons, walking with them through the long days, leading them to water, watching for predators, moving them between pastures as the grass was used up, sleeping near them in the open when the household was spread wide. The wells are always present in these stories, and that is no accident. In a landscape where rainfall is seasonal and unreliable, where springs emerge only in certain favored valleys, water is the thing around which life organizes itself. The wells of Canaan in these ancient centuries were communal places, shared, disputed, dug at great communal effort and maintained with care. To control a well was to control the land around it. To share a well was to be at peace with your neighbors. The tradition returns to wells again and again throughout the Genesis account, because wells were genuinely deeply important, not merely as conveniences but as the very conditions of survival, the fixed points around which the fluid pastoral life circled and returned. The older sons of Jacob, by the time the account reaches this resting point, were grown men, some of them with their own wives, their own children, their own inner lives and disappointments and ambitions. Reuben had already stumbled into a terrible transgression that the account records with careful brevity. Simeon and Levi had acted with a violent ferocity that their father rebuked, though the tradition preserves both sides of that old grief without resolving it entirely. Judah had moved somewhat apart from the household, had married, had suffered loss. These were men shaped by years, by the complicated love and rivalry of a household with many mothers and many competing claims on their father's attention and affection. And at the center of that complexity, though he is not yet the center of the story, not quite yet, there is Joseph, the son of Rachel, the beloved wife, the child born after long waiting. The account tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons, and the tradition is honest about what that uneven love cost everyone. We are simply here, in the hills, in the morning light, breathing the air of a household that is about to be changed, though it does not yet know it. The sky above the limestone hills of Canaan deepens through the day, from pale morning to the hard, bright blue of noon, to the warmer, richer color of the afternoon. The shadows shift. The flocks move. The smell of the camp in the evening, fire smoke and animal warmth, and the particular dusty sweetness of the threshing floor rises up slowly into the cooling air. The older women grind grain between stone querns, the rhythmic scraping sound of it carrying across the quiet. Children run between the tents and are called back. Someone tends a lamp, coaxing the small wick to catch and hold its flame, and the light pools warmly around whoever sits nearest, casting long shadows out across the ground. In the morning, the sons will go out again with the flocks, driving them northward toward the better pastures, toward Shechem or beyond. And Jacob will remain in the valley, as old men do, and the story that has been gathering in the background all this time, the story of the beloved son and the coat and the long road that leads, without anyone quite choosing it, down into Egypt, will begin to move. But that is tomorrow. For now the fire settles low, and the stars come out over Canaan one by one, and the small flame of the lamp burns on through the quiet dark, steady and unhurried, the way a good story breathes when it is given time enough to rest. The hills of Canaan are quiet now, in the long golden hours of late afternoon, when the shadows of the terebinth trees stretch themselves slowly across the dust, and the flocks have settled into their evening stillness. It is the kind of hour that seems to last longer than it should, as though the day itself is reluctant to release the warmth it has gathered. And in that amber slowness, the tents of Jacob's household glow with the last of the sunlight, the fabric lit from without, like lanterns not yet kindled from within. Joseph is young in this part of the story, 17 years old, according to the account, the son of Rachel, the wife whom Jacob had loved with the particular intensity of a man who had waited long and patiently for what he wanted most. And the tradition tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more openly than his other sons, which is one of those simple human facts that carries within it the seed of enormous consequence. He gave him a garment, a long robe, the text says, and generations of translators and storytellers have dressed that garment differently, calling it a coat of many colors or a robe with long sleeves, debating its precise meaning in the ancient Hebrew. But whatever its exact nature, it was a gift that could be seen, a visible sign of favor worn upon the body, and the other brothers could not look at it without feeling something tighten in their chests. There were 10 of them older than Joseph, and they worked hard in the fields and among the flocks, doing the rough and patient labor that pastoral life required. They knew the weight of the day's heat and the chill of night watches, and they came home tired in ways that Joseph, kept close to his father's tent, perhaps did not fully share. The account tells us that they hated him, which is a strong word, and the tradition does not soften it. And when Joseph told them his dreams of sheaves bowing down, of the sun and the moon and 11 stars making obeisance, the hatred deepened into something that required action to relieve it. The moment comes when the brothers are far from home, grazing the flocks near Dothan, a place whose ruins archaeologists have traced in the hill country north of Shechem, a real landscape of real soil and stone. Jacob sends Joseph to find them, to see how they fare and bring word back, and the account follows the young man walking northward through the hills, his distinctive robe marking him visible from a distance. The brothers see him coming before he arrives, and the story goes that they said to one another, almost casually, as men speak of practical matters, "Here comes the dreamer." What happened at the pit is told plainly in the Genesis account, without elaboration, which somehow makes it feel more present rather than less. The brothers stripped him of his robe, that visible hateful robe, and threw him into an empty cistern, one of those stone-lined pits dug for water collection that dotted the landscape of Canaan, dry at this season. Then they sat down to eat bread. That detail, sitting down to eat bread while their brother waited in the stone darkness below them, is one of those moments in ancient narrative that needs no commentary to be felt. It is Judah, the account says, who suggested they sell the boy rather than leave him to die, and a caravan of Ishmaelite traders was passing on its way down toward Egypt, carrying spices and balm and myrrh on their camels, the aromatics of the Levantine trade that moved steadily along the roads connecting Mesopotamia to the Nile. Joseph was pulled from the pit and sold for 20 pieces of silver, a price that historians of the ancient economy note was roughly consistent with the going rate for a young male slave in the second millennium before the Common Era, which gives the transaction a mundane precision that is somehow more affecting than dramatic invention could be. The brothers took the robe and dipped it in the blood of a slaughtered goat and brought it to their father, and Jacob, seeing it, drew the conclusion they had intended him to draw, that a wild animal had killed his beloved son. And he mourned, the text says, for many days, refusing to be comforted, which is a kind of grief that those who have lost someone suddenly and without explanation will recognize, the grief that cannot rest because it has nowhere to place itself. Meanwhile, the caravan moved south and west, following the roads that traders had followed for centuries before, crossing the Sinai toward the delta country of Egypt. And Joseph traveled with it, carried by the ordinary commerce of the ancient world, from his father's tents into a civilization of immense scale and complexity. Egypt in this period, historians debate precisely when to set the patriarchal narratives, with suggestions ranging across several centuries of the second millennium before the Common Era, was a land of temples and granaries, of the Nile's annual flooding, and the black fertile soil it left behind, of scribes and administrators, and a state apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. It must have been for a young man from the pastoral hills of Canaan, something very close to overwhelming. The account places him in the household of a man named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, a captain of the guard, which is to say a man of some standing in the apparatus of Egyptian power. And the tradition tells us that Joseph prospered there, that he was capable and trustworthy, and that Potiphar placed the running of his household in Joseph's hands. There is something restful in the way the narrative lingers here for a moment, in this domestic rhythm of competent work and earned trust, before the next turn comes. Joseph rises within the house. The household flourishes under his management. For a time, things are simply ordered and calm. Then comes the accusation, the story that has been told and retold across many cultures, the servant falsely accused by the master's wife, a narrative pattern scholars have found echoed in Egyptian tales such as the story of the two brothers, which suggests how deeply these themes were woven into the storytelling traditions of the ancient Near East. The account in Genesis is brief and relatively unadorned. Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of assault. Potiphar, whose heart must have been divided between belief and doubt, has Joseph imprisoned. And there is a quality of stillness in the way the narrative handles this. Joseph does not protest at length, does not rage, does not bargain. He is placed in the prison where the king's prisoners were confined, and the story simply continues. The prison, too, becomes a place of quiet competence. The account tells us that the keeper of the prison trusted Joseph, gave him responsibility over the other prisoners, and that once again, wherever Joseph went, things came to order around him. There is something the tradition seems to be pointing toward in this repeated pattern. The rise, the fall, the rising again within the fallen place, as though the story is tracing the shape of a wheel turning slowly in the dark, and the watcher is meant to notice not the reversals, but the continuity beneath them. Two of Pharaoh's officers are imprisoned with him, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, men who had offended the king in some way the text does not specify. Each of them dreams a dream in the night, and each wakes troubled by it, and Joseph notices their troubled faces in the morning, the way an attentive person notices the small weather of others' moods. He interprets their dreams, and the interpretations prove correct. The cupbearer is restored to his position, the baker is executed, exactly as Joseph had said. And Joseph asks the cupbearer gently to remember him when things go well, to mention him to Pharaoh, to help him find his way out of a place where he has done nothing to deserve confinement. The account says that the chief cupbearer forgot him, and that Joseph waited 2 full years more in that prison, the lamplight of those years burning slowly, one after another, in a place of stone and patience. 2 years is a long time to wait when one is young, and the narrative does not gloss over the waiting. It simply lets it sit, the way long time always sits, quietly and without ceremony, until the moment that changes it comes. That moment is approaching, as slowly and inevitably as the Nile swells toward its season. Somewhere above the prison walls, in the great palace of Egypt, Pharaoh is sleeping, and in his sleep 2 dreams are forming themselves, 7 fat cattle, and 7 lean, 7 full ears of grain, and 7 withered. And when morning comes, he will wake with the particular unease of a man who knows he has been shown something he cannot yet read. The cupbearer, stirred at last by the sight of his master's distress, will remember the young man in the prison who understood such things. But that turning of the wheel belongs to the next part of the story, and for now, the night is deep and the lamp burns low, and there is nothing left to do but rest within the long, slow patience of the years. The desert road from Canaan down into Egypt is long and pale and wide, and a caravan moving along it at the pace of old men and laden donkeys would pass through a gradual softening of the air, a deepening of the dust's color from gray-white to the warm ochre of the Nile's ancient breathing, the sky above growing somehow larger and more luminous the further south one traveled, as though the land itself were opening its hands. It is along this road, according to the tradition, that an old man named Jacob made his final great journey, leaving behind the hills of Canaan where his fathers had wandered, and his own long life had been folded and unfolded like a cloth, heading toward a son he had believed for many years to be dead. The account tells it with a quietness that feels almost dreamlike. Joseph, by now a man of middle years, powerful and composed in the courts of Pharaoh, had revealed himself to his brothers in a moment the tradition preserves with great tenderness. Weeping so loudly, the story goes, that the Egyptians in the adjoining rooms could hear him. He had looked at the men who had once sold him into the pit, and had seen not enemies, but something more complicated and more human, and the word he had offered them was not condemnation, but consolation. "You did not send me here," the account records him saying. "It was something else, something larger, that sent me here before you." And with that, the long silence between brothers was broken, and wagons were loaded, and gifts were gathered, and word was sent north along the road to an old man sitting among the hills. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive, historians note that the text pauses, almost as if the narrator needed a moment too, before telling us that the old man's heart grew numb, and then that he believed, and then simply that he prepared to go. He stopped at Beersheba on the way south, that ancient well place where the tradition says his grandfather Abraham had planted a tamarisk tree, and called upon a name that had followed the family ever since. And there, in the gentle light of an evening fire, the account tells that he received a reassurance in the night, that the journey was right, that he would not be left alone in this foreign land, that the long thread of the promise had not frayed. The fire's warmth would have reached his face in the darkness, familiar and steady, and perhaps that was enough to carry him forward in the morning. The reunion, when it came, is one of the quieter wonders of the whole long Genesis account. Joseph rode out in his chariot to meet his father, and the story goes that when they came to one another, Joseph fell upon his father's neck and wept there a long while, and Jacob said only that he could now depart in peace, having seen the face he had mourned for so many years. Historians and readers across the centuries have noted the restrained tenderness of this moment. No speech of recrimination, no explanation of the years between, only an old man's face against his son's shoulder and the sound of weeping in the open air of Goshen, that green and watered region of the eastern Nile Delta, where the tradition says the family was settled, the grass soft beneath them and the river somewhere not far away, carrying its ancient, unhurried freight of water toward the sea. The family that descended into Egypt was large, the account careful to name them. The genealogy lists 70 souls in all, though scholars note that the numbers carry symbolic weight in ancient Near Eastern tradition as much as precise count, the number 70 representing completeness and wholeness, a full household, a nation beginning to gather itself from a single wandering line. They came with their flocks and their tents, and everything accumulated through all the years in Canaan, and Pharaoh received them, and Joseph presented his brothers, and the land of Goshen was given to them. And for a time there was abundance and ease, and the relief of a long tension finally resolved. Jacob himself was brought before Pharaoh, and the text preserves a moment of quiet dignity. Pharaoh asked the old man his age, and Jacob answered that he had lived 130 years, and that they had been few and difficult years compared with those of his fathers. But he blessed Pharaoh nonetheless, this wandering shepherd, blessing the most powerful man in the known world with the unhurried generosity of someone who has walked a very long road and arrived, at last, somewhere warm. Historians find in this scene a kind of deliberate irony and grace both at once, the landless patriarch and the enthroned king, and the benediction flowing unexpectedly from the older and poorer man. Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years after that, the account tells us, and when his death drew near, he called his sons around him, and the tradition preserves his final words as a long and intricate poem, a series of blessings and characterizations of each son, dense with the imagery of animals and vines and the movements of water, the language old and sometimes obscure even to scholars of ancient Hebrew. He blessed Judah with the image of a lion, and Zebulun with the harbor of the sea, and Joseph with the blessings of the deep that crouches beneath the earth, that ancient image of the life-giving water below the world's surface, the invisible spring that the desert peoples knew was always there, even when the surface above them was dry and cracked and silent. He asked only that he be buried not in Egypt, but back in the cave at Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah lay, where Isaac and Rebekah lay, where Leah had been laid to rest, that sheltered place in the Hebron hills where the family had chosen to return its dead to the ground, the stone cool and the air still inside. And so the book that began with the darkness over the face of the deep, with the first stirring of light across unformed waters, draws itself slowly to its close. The tradition has carried us a very long way tonight, and it is worth resting here a moment before sleep comes fully, letting the landscapes we have moved through settled gently around you like a cloth being laid upon still water. We began in the deep silence of the ancient Near East, in the cosmology of a people who looked up at the same stars that every people before and since has looked up at, and tried to put into words what they understood of how the world had come to be. We moved through a garden whose rivers the account names with the careful precision of someone describing a place that once existed, and through the long genealogies that carried human generations like a river carries leaves, unhurried and continuous. We stood at the edge of a remembered flood, in a world of ordinary villages and ordinary smoke, and watched the waters rise and the waters recede, and saw a bow of light stretched across the clearing sky. We followed a man named Abram out of Mesopotamia along the caravan roads under the enormous vault of the desert night, carrying a promise he could not yet see the shape of. We sat by the wells of Canaan where meetings happened and covenants were made, and water was drawn up cool and trembling from the earth. We watched twin brothers quarrel and embrace. Watched a young man in a coat of many colors be cast into a pit and find himself, after years of slow turning, standing in a palace he could not have imagined from the bottom of that darkness. And now we are in Goshen, and the old man has seen his son's face, and the river moves somewhere nearby in the Egyptian dark, wide and slow, and carrying within it the memory of every spring and rainfall that has ever fed it from the mountains. All that water gathered and moving, the way a story gathers all its people and carries them forward, even the ones who are gone. Jacob was buried in Machpelah, as he had asked, and Joseph wept at his grave, and then returned to Egypt. And the account closes with Joseph himself grown very old, telling his brothers that one day, in a time he would not see, the family would leave this land and return to Canaan, and asking only that when they went, they take his bones with them. And then the long book ends, not with thunder or resolution, but with a coffin in Egypt, and a promise still being held, and the story leaving a door open to whatever comes next. Let the river carry you now. Let the images of this long night's traveling dissolve softly into one another, the lamplight of ancient Mesopotamia, the cool air of Canaan's hill country, the green of Goshen at evening, the sound of water found in a dry place. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight. Every wanderer we have followed has arrived somewhere, and you too have arrived, here in the stillness, in the dark, in the gentle quiet before sleep takes you properly. Let your breathing slow. Let the ancient world recede like a shore seen from a boat moving gradually away, growing smaller and more peaceful and more beautiful the further it retreats. Good night, and rest well.